Welcome, dear listener, to Sleepy Rain Horror, where the line between dreams and nightmares blurs. As you drift into the unknown, remember that some whispers are better left unheard. But here, they're impossible to ignore. If you enjoy this tale and haven't fallen asleep yet, or are brave enough to stay awake, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Let's see if you can make it through to the end without a single scream. The rain hammered the forest canopy, turning the dirt path into a muddy labyrinth. Emily adjusted her backpack and tightened her grip on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing twisted roots and rain-slicked leaves. She wasn't supposed to be here. The park ranger's warnings had been clear. Stay away from the woods after dark, especially during a storm. But Emily couldn't resist. This forest, tangled and alive, was her refuge. She'd come back to her hometown to escape her life's chaos, seeking clarity in the only place that had ever felt real. Tonight, though, the forest felt different. It wasn't just the storm. The trees seemed closer, the shadows deeper, as if the woods themselves were watching. She dismissed the uneasy thought and focused on her steps, her boots squelching in the mud. The whispers started faintly, barely audible under the rain. Emily paused, her breath misting in the cold air, and listened. Silence. Only the steady rhythm of rain against leaves and her own pounding heart. She shook her head, muttering to herself, "Just the wind. Or maybe an animal hidden in the underbrush." Emily pressed on. Her goal wasn't far, a forgotten cabin buried deep in the woods. She and her friends had stumbled upon it as teenagers, a place of curiosity and dares. The cabin was their summer secret, its sagging roof and empty windows a mystery they never solved. Some claimed it belonged to a hunter who vanished decades ago. Others whispered darker stories. Emily hadn't thought about it in years. Yet tonight, as the storm rolled in, she felt drawn to it, as though it were calling her. After what felt like hours, she saw it. The cabin stood among the trees, its warped wood and crumbling chimney barely visible in the downpour. Emily felt a strange sense of relief mixed with dread. She approached cautiously, her flashlight illuminating the weathered door. It creaked open at her touch, the sound swallowed by the rain. Inside, the air was damp and heavy, carrying the scent of mildew and decay. Emily scanned the room with her flashlight. A single table, 2 chairs, and a stone fireplace remained, just as she remembered. Cobwebs draped the walls like ghostly curtains, and the floor creaked beneath her boots. She set her backpack down, pulled out a small lantern, and lit it. Its warm glow pushed back the shadows, offering a fragile sense of security. The rain drummed against the roof, a steady rhythm that seemed almost comforting. She sank into one of the chairs, letting out a long breath. The unease lingered, though. The feeling of being watched gnawed at her. The cabin amplified the storm's sounds, the groan of the wood, the whisper of wind slipping through cracks. It felt alive. Emily shook her head. Just nerves. She was alone. She had to be. Then she heard it, a whisper, faint and deliberate. Emily froze, the lantern light flickering as if responding to the sound. She strained to listen, her heart thundering. It came again, low and guttural, words she couldn't understand. Her skin prickled with cold fear. She swung the flashlight toward the far corner of the room. The beam landed on empty shelves coated in dust. But the sound seemed to come from there, from something unseen. "Hello," she called, her voice shaking. The whisper stopped. Silence enveloped the room. Emily's fingers tightened around the flashlight as she stepped closer to the shelves. Her free hand touched the damp wood, the icy surface making her recoil. She shone the light higher, and her breath hitched. In the soot-streaked bricks of the fireplace, a handprint was etched, a long, thin mark, its fingers impossibly sharp. Emily backed away, her pulse racing. The whisper returned, louder now, surrounding her. She turned toward the door, but it slammed shut with a force that sent a shudder through the cabin. Panic surged as the lantern flickered violently and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Emily fumbled with her flashlight, the beam flickering as if struggling to stay alive. The whisper became a chorus of voices, each overlapping the other, filling her ears with unintelligible words. And then, from the doorway, a figure appeared. Emily's flashlight illuminated its silhouette, tall and unnaturally thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The shadows seemed to cling to it, writhing like smoke. Emily's breath caught. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring her fear. "You came back," it said, the voice raspy and hollow. The words shattered Emily's paralysis. She bolted for the window, hurling herself through the glass. Pain seared her arms as shards tore into her skin, but she didn't stop. The rain swallowed her as she landed outside, scrambling to her feet and running blindly into the storm. The whispers followed, carried on the wind, growing fainter as she stumbled through the woods. The trail was a blur of mud and shadow, but she ran without thinking, her legs moving on pure instinct. The storm seemed to ease as she neared the edge of the forest, the cabin's presence fading behind her. Finally, she broke free of the trees, collapsing onto the wet grass of the clearing. Her chest heaved as she stared back at the dark expanse of woods. The whispers were gone, and the night was silent again, save for the soft patter of rain. Emily didn't wait to catch her breath. She stood and walked toward the faint lights of town in the distance. Her hands trembled, her mind racing with what she had seen, what she had heard. The cabin's memory was etched into her, a shadow that wouldn't fade. As she reached the edge of the forest, she paused and looked back one last time. The woods loomed silently, their secrets hidden once more. Emily turned away, but deep in her heart, she knew the truth. The cabin had called her back, and it wasn't finished with her. Emily couldn't stop trembling, even after she had reached the safety of her apartment. Rain still pelted against the windows as she wrapped herself in a blanket and stared at the steaming cup of tea she'd made but couldn't bring herself to drink. Her hands shook, and her mind raced with fragments of the night. The silhouette in the doorway, the whispers that seemed to come from the very walls of the cabin, and the chilling rasp. "You came back." She clutched her mug tightly, trying to ground herself, but the memory of the figure was burned into her mind. What had she seen? Was it real? The rational part of her wanted to dismiss it all as a trick of the storm, her imagination running wild in the isolation of the woods. But the sharp sting of the cuts on her arms, the bruise on her side from crashing through the window, reminded her it had been all too real. She grabbed her phone and hesitated. Who could she call? Her friends had all moved away, and no one would believe her. The thought of explaining it, "I saw something in the woods," something not human, sounded ridiculous, even in her own head. Yet, she couldn't just leave it alone. She needed answers. Her fingers moved almost instinctively as she typed into a search engine. Haunted cabin in Eastwood Forest. Dozens of results popped up, local legends, amateur blogs, and a few blurry photographs of the cabin. She scrolled through, scanning headlines like The Vanishing Huntsman of Eastwood and Cursed Grounds or Hoax. One link caught her attention. Disappearance at Eastwood Cabin, the unsolved case of 1987. Emily clicked. The article told the story of a man named Daniel Carr, a local hiker who vanished without a trace. His friends claimed he had gone into the forest alone, saying he wanted to investigate the cabin. Witnesses described him as a skeptic, someone who laughed off the ghost stories. But Daniel never returned. Search parties combed the woods for weeks, but no evidence of him was ever found, not even a footprint. Emily leaned closer to the screen, her pulse quickening as she read the final line of the article. Locals claim the cabin calls to its victims, luring them deeper into the woods, and that those who return are never the same. She sat back, her stomach churning. The cabin had called her too. She couldn't explain it, but she knew it had. The pull she felt that evening, the overwhelming urge to go back after all these years, it wasn't a coincidence. But why her? What did it want? A sudden knock at the door made her jump, spilling tea onto her lap. She cursed under her breath and grabbed a towel before cautiously approaching the door. The hallway light flickered as she peered through the peephole. No one was there. Another knock, louder this time, echoed through the apartment. Emily's heart pounded as she slowly opened the door. The hallway was empty. Her breath hitched as she stepped into the corridor, looking left, then right. The building was silent, except for the muffled hum of someone's television. She was about to close the door when she noticed something on the floor. A single piece of paper lay at her feet, soaked from an unseen source of water. She picked it up, her hands trembling as she unfolded it. The words were scrawled in uneven, jagged letters. "You shouldn't have come back." Her knees nearly buckled. She slammed the door shut and locked it, pressing her back against the cool wood. Her breathing was shallow as she reread the note, the words etched into her mind. Someone knew she had been at the cabin, but how? No one had seen her go there, and the forest had been empty. Or so she thought. Emily spent the rest of the night with all the lights on, jumping at every creak and groan of the building. When she finally drifted off just before dawn, her dreams were restless and dark. She was back in the woods, the whispers louder this time, pressing against her ears like a swarm of insects. The figure from the cabin loomed in the shadows, its head tilting as it spoke. "You can't escape." When she woke, her body ached, and her neck was damp with sweat. The room felt colder than it should have been, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. She sat up slowly, every muscle tense, and froze when she saw her desk. The note from the hallway was gone. Emily tore through her apartment, searching every corner, but it was nowhere to be found. Panic bubbled in her chest as she tried to rationalize it. Maybe she had thrown it away without realizing. Maybe the storm had frayed her nerves more than she thought. But deep down, she knew the truth. It had disappeared, just like the cabin wanted her to. She needed to know more. Sitting on the edge of her bed, she grabbed her phone and opened her contacts. There was one person who might help. Mark, her childhood friend, had always been obsessed with the cabin. He was the one who found it first, dragging their group of friends there with stories about hidden treasure and long-lost secrets. He'd know what to do. The phone rang twice before a groggy voice answered. "Emily, it's been years. What's going on?" She hesitated, unsure how much to say. "Mark, I need your help. Do you remember the cabin in Eastwood Forest?" There was a long pause, and when Mark spoke again, his voice was serious. "Yeah. Why, I went back last night." "Why the hell would you do that?" he asked sharply. "You know what they say about that place." "I thought it was just stories," she snapped, then softened. "I didn't believe any of it. But, Mark, something happened. Something I can't explain." Mark sighed heavily. "Meet me at the diner in an hour. And, Emily, don't go back into the woods. Whatever you saw, it's not finished with you." His words echoed in her mind as she hung up. She dressed quickly and grabbed her keys, the memory of the cabin's whispers still fresh. Mark's warning weighed on her, but part of her already knew. Staying away wouldn't be an option. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and grease, its fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow over the cracked vinyl booths. Emily sat in the far corner, her back to the wall, watching the door as if the cabin's shadows might follow her here. She cradled a cup of coffee in her hands, its warmth a small comfort. The storm outside had finally eased, but the memory of the previous night clung to her like a second skin. Mark arrived 10 minutes later, his dark hair disheveled and his jacket dripping from the rain. He looked older than she remembered, his face lined with worry. He slid into the booth across from her, shaking the water from his sleeves. "Emily," he said, his voice low, "what the hell is going on?" She didn't answer immediately, unsure where to start. Finally, she took a deep breath and told him everything. The pull to return to the woods, the whispers in the cabin, the figure, and the note left at her door. Mark listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with every word. When she finished, he sat back and rubbed his hands over his face. "You shouldn't have gone back," he muttered. "I didn't know," she said defensively. "How was I supposed to? It was just a stupid old cabin from our childhood." Mark leaned forward, his voice a harsh whisper. "It's not just a cabin, Emily. You know that. We always joked about it, but we felt it back then, didn't we? That presence, that pull. And you felt it again, didn't you? It called you." Emily nodded reluctantly. "But why? Why me?" Mark hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notebook. Its edges were frayed, the cover stained from years of use. He slid it across the table. "I've been looking into the cabin ever since we found it. There's more to it than just local legends." Emily opened the notebook and flipped through its pages. They were filled with handwritten notes, sketches, and newspaper clippings. One headline caught her eye. "Local family disappears without a trace, 1956. Beneath it, Mark had scrawled a single line. "Last seen heading toward Eastwood Forest." She looked up at him, her throat dry. "You think this is connected?" Mark nodded grimly. "There's a pattern, Emily. Every few decades, someone goes missing near that cabin. Sometimes it's hikers, sometimes it's families. And the ones who do come back," he trailed off, his gaze distant. "What about them?" "They're not the same," he said. "They change. Some go mad. Others just fade, like something drained the life out of them. It's like the cabin takes something from them." Emily shivered. "What does it want?" Mark shook his head. "I don't know. But there's more." He flipped to another page and pointed to a sketch of the cabin. "I went back once years ago, after you and the others moved away. I felt the pull too, But I didn't go inside. I couldn't. He glanced at her, his eyes filled with guilt. I think whatever's in there, it's alive, Emily. Not like you or me, but something ancient, something that feeds off us. The words hung between them, heavy and oppressive. Emily closed the notebook and pushed it back toward him. I can't just ignore this, Mark. It's not going to let me. You don't have to do anything, he said firmly. Stay away from the woods. Stay in the city. Whatever it is, it can't reach you here. But Emily wasn't so sure. The note at her door, the whispers in her dreams, they weren't confined to the forest. The cabin had already reached her, and she knew it wouldn't stop. As if on cue, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and froze. The text had no sender, just a blank space where the number should be. The message read, "Come back." Mark leaned over to read it, his expression grim. It's already started, hasn't it? Emily nodded, her stomach twisting. What do I do? Mark hesitated, then leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. There's one thing I found. It's risky, and I don't even know if it'll work. But what? She pressed. There's an old ritual, he said. It's supposed to sever the connection between you and the cabin, but it has to be done there, on the grounds. And you have to face whatever's inside. The blood drained from Emily's face. You're saying I have to go back? Mark nodded, his jaw tight. If you want to end this, yes. But I'm coming with you. You can't do this alone. Emily wanted to argue, to insist that she could handle it herself, but the truth was she was terrified. The thought of stepping back into those woods, of facing whatever waited for her in that cabin, made her stomach churn. But she couldn't deny the pull. The cabin had marked her, and it wouldn't let go until she confronted it. Okay, she said finally. We'll go tonight. Mark's eyes widened. Tonight? Are you crazy? We need time to prepare. There's no time, she said, showing him the text. It's not going to wait, and neither can we. Mark sighed heavily but nodded. Fine, but we do this right. Meet me at my place in an hour. I'll get the supplies. As they left the diner, the rain began to fall again, a soft drizzle that soaked through Emily's jacket. She glanced back at the warm glow of the diner's lights, knowing it might be the last safe place she'd see for a long time. The forest loomed in the distance, its shadow stretching across the town like a silent threat. Emily tightened her grip on her keys and took a deep breath. Whatever the cabin wanted, she was going to face it, and this time, she wouldn't run. Emily stood on Mark's porch, the rain seeping into her clothes as she waited. The air smelled of damp earth and ozone, heavy with the storm's lingering energy. She gripped her flashlight tightly, its cold metal grounding her as fear churned in her chest. A faint light glowed from inside the house, and moments later, the door creaked open. Mark ushered her in quickly, locking the door behind them. His living room was cluttered, books stacked on every surface, papers scattered haphazardly, and a faint smell of burning sage lingering in the air. On the coffee table lay an assortment of items. Candles, a length of rope, a small brass bowl, and a weathered leather-bound book. This is what we'll need, Mark said, gesturing toward the table. Emily eyed the items warily. Are you sure about this ritual? You don't even know if it works. Mark nodded, though his expression betrayed his doubt. It's the only thing I could find. The book is old, centuries, maybe, and it describes a process for severing a bond with a spirit or place. If the cabin marked you, this might be the only way to stop it. Emily swallowed hard. And if it doesn't work, then we leave, Mark said, his voice firm. We'll figure something else out, but we'll do this together. She nodded, grateful for his presence despite the terror bubbling inside her. What do we have to do? Mark picked up the book and flipped to a bookmarked page. The faded text was written in a language she didn't recognize, accompanied by crude drawings of symbols and figures. He explained the steps. They would create a circle of protection around the cabin, light the candles, and burn a piece of Emily's clothing, something infused with her essence. The final step required her to confront whatever entity inhabited the cabin and speak the words of severance. It's dangerous, Mark warned. The book says the spirit, or whatever it is, won't let you go without a fight. You have to be strong, Emily. No matter what happens, don't break the circle. She nodded, her hands trembling. Let's get it over with. The drive to the forest was silent, the hum of the car engine the only sound between them. The storm had passed, but the clouds lingered, blocking out the moonlight. The woods loomed ahead, a dark, impenetrable wall. Mark parked at the trailhead, and they gathered their supplies in tense silence. As they stepped onto the muddy path, the air grew colder. The trees, once familiar and inviting, seemed to twist and lean toward them, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers. Emily felt the pull again, stronger this time, like an invisible hand guiding her forward. "You okay?" Mark asked, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. She nodded, though every step felt heavier. "Let's just keep moving." The cabin appeared suddenly, as though the woods had been hiding it until the last moment. Its warped wood and shattered windows seemed more menacing now, the shadows around it darker and deeper. Emily's breath hitched as the whispers began, faint but insistent, brushing against her ears like a cold wind. Mark set to work immediately, placing the candles in a wide circle around the cabin and carving symbols into the ground with a small knife. Emily stayed close, clutching the brass bowl and the piece of cloth they had prepared, a torn scrap from the jacket she had worn the night before. The air grew heavier as they worked, the whispers growing louder, overlapping into a dissonant chorus. Emily could feel the cabin watching her, its presence pressing against her mind. When the circle was complete, Mark lit the candles. Their flickering flames cast eerie shadows across the ground, and the whispers paused, as if the cabin were waiting. "Emily," Mark said, his voice steady but low, "this is where it gets dangerous. You need to step into the circle and face it. I'll be here, but you're the one it's tied to." She nodded, her throat tight. She stepped into the circle, clutching the brass bowl in one hand and the scrap of cloth in the other. The whispers surged, louder and angrier now, as though the cabin knew what they were doing. She placed the cloth in the bowl and lit it with one of the candles. The flames flared unnaturally bright, casting a sickly green light. The whispers became a roar, and the ground beneath her feet trembled. And then it appeared. The figure stepped out of the cabin's doorway, its movements jerky and unnatural. It was taller than she remembered, its limbs impossibly thin and its head tilting at an angle that defied anatomy. Shadows clung to it like smoke, writhing and twisting as it moved closer. "You came back," it rasped, its voice filling the air like a physical presence. Emily forced herself to stand her ground, the words of the ritual trembling on her lips. "I sever the bond," she began, her voice shaking. I renounce you. You have no claim on me. The figure paused, its head snapping upright. You cannot escape, it hissed. The shadows around it surged forward, slamming into the edge of the circle. The candles flickered violently, but the symbols held. Mark shouted from behind her, "Keep going." Emily took a deep breath, her voice stronger now. "I sever the bond. I reclaim my soul. You will not follow me." The figure let out a shriek, its form distorting as the shadows around it writhed and shrank. The cabin itself seemed to groan, its walls buckling inward as though collapsing under an unseen force. The light from the burning cloth flared brighter, and the figure recoiled, its body twisting as it was pulled backward. "You cannot break free," it screamed, its voice echoing in the air. Emily closed her eyes and shouted the final words of the ritual. A deafening roar filled her ears, and the world seemed to collapse around her. When she opened her eyes, the figure was gone. The cabin stood silent and empty, its oppressive presence lifted. The whispers had vanished, leaving only the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. Mark stepped into the circle and grabbed her shoulder. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with relief. Emily nodded, her body trembling with exhaustion. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. The cabin was still there, waiting, and she could feel its gaze even as they walked away. Some things, she realized, could never truly be severed. The silence in the woods as they walked away felt unnatural. No birds, no rustling leaves, only the sound of their boots crunching against the dirt trail. Emily kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting the figure to reappear, or the cabin itself to rise and follow them. But the woods remained still, an oppressive quiet that pressed against her ears. "You sure it's done?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark hesitated before answering, his flashlight beam dancing along the path ahead. "I'm not sure of anything, but you spoke the words, and the circle held. Whatever connection you had to it should be broken." Emily clutched her arms to her chest as if trying to shield herself from an invisible weight. "Then why do I feel like it's still there, watching?" Mark stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression somber. "Because it is. Whatever that thing was, it's ancient, powerful. The ritual wasn't about destroying it. It was about freeing you. That's the best we could do." Her stomach twisted. She wanted to believe him, but the cabin's pull still lingered in the edges of her mind, like a faint thread she couldn't quite sever. The car came into view, parked at the edge of the woods. Emily's steps quickened, her breath hitching as they reached the vehicle. Mark unlocked the doors, and she climbed into the passenger seat, slamming the door behind her. The safety of the car felt fragile, a thin barrier between them and whatever lurked in the forest. As they drove back toward town, the trees lining the road seemed to close in, their shadows stretching long and thin under the weak glow of the headlights. Mark kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "We should talk about what's next," he said after a long silence. Emily glanced at him, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "What do you mean?" "You can't stay here, Emily," he said bluntly. "Even if the bond is broken, that thing isn't going to stop watching you. It knows you. It might wait years, decades even, but it'll try again." She swallowed hard. "You're saying I have to leave everything behind?" "I'm saying you should start over. Go somewhere far away, where it can't find you as easily." He glanced at her, his expression serious. It's the only way to be safe. Emily looked out the window, her chest tightening. She had spent her entire life in this town. Every memory, good and bad, was tied to these streets, these woods. The thought of leaving felt like tearing out a piece of herself. But deep down, she knew he was right. They drove in silence the rest of the way, the weight of Mark's words hanging between them. By the time they reached her apartment, the rain had started again, a light drizzle that soaked the streets and glistened under the streetlights. "I'll walk you up," Mark said, pulling the car to a stop. Emily shook her head. "You don't have to. I'll be fine." Mark hesitated, then nodded. "Call me if anything happens." "Anything." She gave him a small, grateful smile and stepped out of the car, the cold rain stinging her skin. Her apartment building loomed ahead, its familiar brick facade offering a hollow sense of comfort. Inside, the silence felt oppressive. She locked the door behind her and turned on every light, needing to banish the shadows. The living room looked exactly as she had left it, normal, untouched, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She checked the windows, the closet, even under the bed, before finally collapsing onto the couch. Her body ached, her mind racing with everything that had happened. She closed her eyes, willing herself to breathe, to calm down. And then she heard it, a faint knock. Her eyes flew open, and she sat up, her heart hammering in her chest. The knock came again, soft but insistent. It was coming from the front door. Emily froze, her mind racing. Mark had just left. He wouldn't have come back so soon. And no one else knew what had happened. The knock came a third time, louder now. She rose slowly, her feet barely making a sound on the carpet. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door. "Who is it?" she called, her voice shaky. There was no answer. Another knock, harder this time. Her heart was pounding so loudly she thought it might drown out the sound. She glanced through the peephole, but the hallway outside was empty. And yet, the knocking continued. Emily stumbled back from the door, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She grabbed her phone and dialed Mark's number. "Mark," she whispered when he answered. "It's here. It followed me. What's happening?" "The door," she said, her voice cracking. "It's knocking, but there's no one there." Mark cursed under his breath. "Don't open it, Emily. Whatever you do, don't open it. I'm coming back now." The knocking grew louder, more frantic, as though whatever was on the other side could hear him. The sound reverberated through the apartment, filling every corner. "Mark, hurry," she pleaded. The knocking stopped abruptly. The silence was worse. Emily held her breath, her eyes fixed on the door. She thought she was imagining it at first, but then she saw it, the doorknob slowly turning, as if an unseen hand were trying to open it. "No," she whispered, backing away. The knob stopped moving, and for a moment everything was still. Then came the voice, a low, guttural whisper, seeping through the cracks of the door like smoke. "You can't run. You can't hide. You are mine." Emily screamed. Emily dropped the phone as the voice slithered through the door, her scream echoing off the apartment walls. She stumbled backward, her legs shaking so violently she nearly collapsed. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the cabin's shadow had followed her into the safety of her home. "Emily." Mark's voice crackled from the phone lying on the floor. "Emily, are you there? Talk to me." She couldn't speak. Her back hit the wall, and she pressed herself against it, her eyes fixed on the door. The voice continued, low and taunting, words she couldn't fully understand but felt deep in her bones. The doorknob twisted again, harder this time, rattling violently. The door didn't open. Mark's voice broke through her paralysis. "Emily, listen to me. It's testing you, trying to scare you into breaking. You have to hold on. I'm almost there." The sound of his voice steadied her, if only a little. She forced herself to move, sliding down the wall to grab her phone. "It's trying to get in," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It can't," Mark said firmly. "Not unless you let it. Whatever connection it has to you isn't strong enough anymore. Not since the ritual. But you have to stay strong. Don't give it any way in. Understand?" Emily nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Hurry." The voice outside fell silent, and for a moment, the apartment was eerily quiet. Then the lights flickered, the bulbs buzzing faintly before dimming to a sickly yellow glow. A chill swept through the room, and the shadows seemed to stretch and writhe, reaching for her. "Mark," she said, her voice shaking. "Something's wrong." "Stay where you are," he said. "Don't move." The air grew colder, each breath forming a faint cloud in front of her. She clutched the phone tightly, her knuckles white. The shadows continued to shift, and as she stared, she realized they weren't just moving, they were forming shapes. Figures. They emerged from the corners of the room, tall and gaunt, their faces obscured by darkness. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as if savoring her fear. Emily pressed herself tighter against the wall, her heart racing. "You're not real," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're not real." The figures stopped. One of them tilted its head, the motion unnervingly familiar, and stepped closer. Its voice was a distorted echo of her own. "Are you sure?" Emily squeezed her eyes shut, clutching the phone to her chest. "Mark, please," she whispered. "I'm here," he said, his voice loud and clear. "Emily, open the door. I'm right outside." Her eyes snapped open, and she scrambled to her feet, her body trembling with relief. She ran to the door and flung it open, nearly collapsing into Mark's arms. He steadied her, his face pale and drawn. "It's okay," he said, guiding her inside and closing the door firmly behind him. "I'm here now." But as soon as the door shut, the apartment grew darker. The lights flickered again, and the temperature dropped even further. Mark glanced around, his jaw tightening. "It's still here." Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. "It's everywhere." Mark set down the bag he brought with him and pulled out a bundle of sage and a lighter. He lit the sage, the sharp, earthy scent filling the air as he walked around the apartment, muttering words under his breath. The shadows recoiled at first, retreating to the edges of the room, but they didn't disappear. Instead, they seemed to gather, growing denser and darker. "It's not enough," Emily said, her voice rising in panic. Mark stopped, his eyes scanning the room. "It's stronger than I thought. The cabin. It's not just a place. It's something else, something that can move beyond its walls. What do we do?" He hesitated, then reached into the bag again, pulling out a small, ornate dagger. Its blade was etched with symbols, and the hilt glinted in the dim light. "What is that?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "It's a focus," he said. If the cabin spirit followed you, it means the bond wasn't completely severed. This might help finish what the ritual started. Emily stared at the blade, her stomach twisting. What do I have to do? Mark handed her the dagger, his expression grim. You have to face it, Emily. Confront it directly. If it's tied to you, you're the only one who can end this. She looked at the blade, its weight unfamiliar in her hand. The thought of using it filled her with dread, but she knew Mark was right. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to stop. The shadows began to shift again, coalescing into a single massive form in the center of the room. The air grew heavier, pressing down on her chest, and the whispers returned, louder and more chaotic. You can't escape, the voice hissed, deep and guttural. You belong to me. Emily gripped the dagger tightly, stepping forward despite the fear clawing at her. I don't belong to you, she said, her voice shaking but resolute. You have no power over me. The figure lunged, its form twisting and writhing as it surged toward her. Mark shouted something, but she couldn't hear him over the roar in her ears. With a cry, she drove the dagger into the shadow's center. The room exploded with light, blinding and all-encompassing. The roar turned into a deafening scream, and the figure writhed violently before shattering into fragments of darkness that evaporated into nothing. When the light faded, Emily was on her knees, the dagger still clutched in her hand. The apartment was silent. Mark rushed to her side, helping her to her feet. Is it over? He asked, his voice filled with cautious hope. She looked around, the oppressive weight in the air finally gone. The room felt lighter, warmer. For the first time in days, she could breathe. I think so, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But deep down, she wasn't entirely sure. The following days passed in a haze of exhaustion and unease. Emily couldn't tell if it was the ritual, the confrontation, or the sheer weight of her fear that left her feeling drained. Mark stayed by her side, rarely leaving her apartment, but even his presence wasn't enough to dispel the tension that lingered like an invisible fog. The nights were the worst. Though the whispers and shadows had vanished, Emily's dreams were plagued by visions of the cabin. Its warped walls and blackened windows loomed over her, the heavy air inside choking her as she tried to escape. And always, there was the voice, low, insidious, whispering promises she couldn't ignore. It's not over, she murmured one morning, staring blankly at the steam rising from her coffee. Mark glanced at her from the kitchen counter, where he was sorting through a stack of old books. What makes you say that? She shook her head, unable to explain. The weight in her chest told her the truth, even if everything else seemed normal. The bond might have been weakened, but she could still feel the cabin's presence, a distant hum at the edges of her mind. Mark set down the book he was holding and sat across from her. Then we need to figure out how to finish this. Completely. Emily looked at him, her expression hollow. What if we can't? We have to try, he said firmly. Whatever this thing is, it's not invincible. It's tied to you, which means it can be severed. For good this time. She wanted to believe him. By the afternoon, Mark had pieced together a theory. He spread out his notes on the coffee table, the pages covered in symbols, translations, and fragmented explanations. The cabin isn't just some haunted building, he said, pointing to a passage in one of the books. It's a conduit, a physical manifestation of something much older. These kinds of entities feed on connection, on people. Emily nodded slowly. And I was the one who gave it that connection. Exactly. But the bond goes both ways. That's why you can still feel it, and why it can still reach for you. She swallowed hard. So how do we cut it off completely? Mark hesitated, his finger tracing a line of text. There's a way, but it's risky. Tell me, she said, her voice steady despite the fear creeping into her chest. He turned the book toward her, pointing to an illustration of a figure standing in the center of a circle, surrounded by burning symbols. You have to go back to the cabin. Emily's heart sank. Are you serious? She asked, her voice rising. After everything we've done to get away from it, you want me to go back? It's the only way, Mark said, his tone firm. The bond wasn't fully severed because part of you is still tied to that place. You need to confront it where it's strongest, on its own ground. She stared at the illustration, the symbols blurring as tears filled her eyes. What if I can't do it? What if it traps me again? Mark reached across the table, his hand resting on hers. You won't be alone this time. I'll be with you every step of the way. She took a deep breath, nodding. When do we go? Tonight, he said. It's safest in the dark. The cabin thrives on fear, but it's also bound by certain rules. It won't expect us to face it head on. The hours leading up to their departure were a blur. Emily packed a small bag with essentials, her hands shaking as she zipped it shut. Mark triple-checked their supplies. Candles, chalk, the ceremonial dagger, and a handful of protective talismans he had prepared. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they set out, the familiar winding road through the woods bathed in moonlight. The rain had returned, a soft drizzle that soaked through their jackets as they walked. Every step felt heavier than the last. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing louder as the cabin came into view. It looked the same as before, crooked and dark, its windows like hollow eyes watching them approach. Mark lit a lantern, the warm glow pushing back the shadows as they crossed the threshold. The air inside was stifling, the scent of damp wood and decay overwhelming. Here, he said, handing her a piece of chalk. You need to draw the circle, exactly like we practiced. Emily nodded, her hands trembling as she knelt on the floor. She began to draw, the symbols flowing from her memory despite her fear. As she worked, the cabin seemed to come alive. The walls groaned, and the air grew colder, the oppressive presence she had felt before returning with full force. Hurry, Mark urged, his voice tight. She finished the last symbol and stood, her knees weak. Now what? Mark stepped into the circle with her, lighting the candles and placing them at the cardinal points. Now, you call it out. Force it to show itself. The thought made her stomach turn, but she knew there was no other choice. Taking a deep breath, she clutched the dagger and closed her eyes. I'm not afraid of you, she said, her voice trembling but firm. You've taken enough from me. Show yourself. The cabin shuddered, the walls creaking violently. A deep, guttural laugh echoed around them, the sound vibrating through the floor. You think you can challenge me here? The voice boomed. This is my domain. You are nothing. Emily gripped the dagger tighter, her fear giving way to anger. You don't own me. Not anymore. The shadows coalesced, forming a towering figure in the center of the room. Its eyes burned like coals, and its jagged mouth twisted into a grin. You are brave, it said, its voice dripping with malice. But bravery will not save you. Mark began chanting, his voice steady and commanding. The symbols around the circle began to glow, a faint golden light pushing back the darkness. The figure recoiled, its form flickering. Emily stepped forward, raising the dagger. This ends now. With a scream, she drove the blade into the ground, the force of the impact sending a shock wave through the cabin. The light from the symbols erupted, blinding and all-consuming. The figure howled, its form breaking apart as the light consumed it. The cabin shuddered violently, the walls splintering and collapsing inward. When the light faded, Emily and Mark were standing in the clearing where the cabin had once stood. The air was still, the oppressive weight finally gone. Emily dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," she whispered. Mark knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You did it. It's really over." But as they stared at the empty clearing, a faint chill swept through the air. Neither of them noticed the faint outline of the cabin's door flickering in the shadows. Emily didn't look back as they left the clearing, though the faint prickling at the back of her neck told her the cabin hadn't entirely let go. Mark's reassurances echoed in her ears as they walked, but the words felt hollow. They reached the car just as dawn began to creep over the horizon, the pale light breaking through the rain-soaked trees. Emily slid into the passenger seat, her limbs heavy with exhaustion. Mark started the car, the engine rumbling to life, and they pulled away from the woods without another word. The ride home was silent. Emily stared out the window, her thoughts a swirling mess of relief and doubt. The cabin was gone, at least it was no longer visible, but its memory clung to her like a shadow. She could still feel the weight of its presence, faint but undeniable, like a whisper just out of reach. When they arrived back at the apartment, Emily hesitated at the door. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them. Mark touched her arm gently. "It's over, Emily. You severed the bond. Whatever connection it had to you, it's gone." She forced a nod and stepped inside, but the familiar space felt foreign now. The shadows seemed deeper, the corners darker, and the silence oppressive. Mark didn't leave her side, his presence a small comfort as they unpacked the remnants of their supplies. That night, Emily fell into a restless sleep, her dreams a fragmented collage of memories. The cabin's twisted form loomed in the distance, its black windows staring at her. She was running, the forest around her alive with whispers and shadows, but no matter how far she went, the cabin was always there, waiting. She woke with a start, her chest heaving as if she'd been holding her breath. The room was dark, the faint sound of rain pattering against the window. She turned to check the time, but her breath caught in her throat. The clock was blinking, its numbers frozen at 3:13 a.m. Emily sat up slowly, her heart pounding. The room felt colder, the air thick with an almost suffocating presence. She glanced at the door, half expecting to see it twist open, but it remained closed. "Mark," she whispered, her voice barely audible. There was no response. She slid out of bed, her feet touching the cold floor as she made her way to the living room. The faint glow of the streetlights outside barely illuminated the space, and the shadows seemed to shift as she moved. "Mark," she called again, louder this time. A sound behind her made her freeze. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like the creak of a floorboard. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the darkness. The outline of a figure stood in the corner, barely distinguishable from the shadows around it. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, its presence oppressive and familiar. Emily's breath quickened, her mind racing. She knew that shape, that feeling. The cabin's voice echoed in her memory, low and mocking. "You think you've won." The figure stepped forward, its form becoming clearer in the dim light. It wasn't a shadow. It was her. The figure's face was identical to hers, but its expression was hollow, its eyes dark and empty. A cruel smile twisted its lips as it spoke. "You can't escape me," it said, its voice a distorted echo of her own. "I'm a part of you now." Emily stumbled back, her heart pounding. "You're not real. You're just a memory," the figure interrupted, tilting its head. "Just a dream?" "No, Emily. I'm what's left of the cabin inside you. The part you'll never be rid of." Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head. "I destroyed it. I severed the bond." The figure laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. "You severed one bond, but you created another. Every time you dream of it, every time you think of it, you give it life. You invited me in." Emily's knees buckled, and she sank to the floor. The room seemed to close in around her, the shadows growing darker, thicker. "No," she whispered. "This isn't real." The figure crouched in front of her, its empty eyes locking onto hers. "You can't run from yourself, Emily, and you can't run from me." It reached out, its hand brushing against her cheek. The touch was ice cold, sending a shiver down her spine. Emily closed her eyes, her mind racing. She thought of Mark, of the ritual, of the light that had destroyed the cabin. She clung to those memories, forcing them to the forefront of her mind. "You're not real," she said again, her voice stronger this time. The figure hesitated, its smile faltering. "You're just a fragment," Emily continued, her eyes snapping open. "A piece of something that's already gone, and you have no power over me." The figure snarled, its form flickering like a dying flame. The shadows around it writhed violently, but Emily didn't look away. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice steady. With a final ear-piercing scream, the figure dissolved, its form breaking apart like smoke in the wind. The room was suddenly still, the oppressive weight lifting as the darkness receded. Emily collapsed onto the floor, her body trembling. The air was lighter now, the faint warmth of the coming dawn filtering through the windows. Mark found her there hours later, sitting by the window as the first rays of sunlight bathed the apartment. "It's gone," she said softly, her voice hollow. "For good this time." He didn't ask how she knew. He simply sat beside her, his presence a quiet reassurance. But as the morning light grew stronger, Emily couldn't help but wonder if she was finally free, or if the cabin had only found another way to stay with her. Emily tried to resume her life, but the past clung to her like cobwebs she couldn't shake. The days passed in strained normalcy, but every moment alone brought the creeping sense of being watched. She avoided the dark corners of her apartment, kept the lights on at night, and blasted music to drown out any lingering silence. Mark checked infrequently, reassuring her that the ritual had worked, that what she experienced after was just her mind processing the trauma. "You're free, Emily. You need to believe that." His words were well-meaning, but did little to quiet the nagging sense that freedom came at a price. One evening, as Emily cleaned her apartment in an attempt to distract herself, she came across a small box she didn't remember packing. The edges were worn, and it smelled faintly of damp wood. She hesitated, her chest tightening, but curiosity won over fear. She opened the box to find a single object inside, a weathered key. Its surface was tarnished, but she recognized it instantly. It was the key to the cabin. Emily's breath caught, her pulse quickening. She had never taken a key from the cabin. She would have remembered. The air in the room grew heavy, pressing against her chest as if the walls themselves were closing in. A knock at the door snapped her out of her trance. She dropped the key back into the box and shoved it into a drawer before hurrying to the door. Mark stood in the hallway, holding a bag of groceries. "Thought I'd bring dinner," he said with a smile, but his expression shifted the moment he saw her face. "What's wrong?" Emily stepped aside to let him in, her hands trembling. "I found something I shouldn't have." He set the bag down and turned to her, his brow furrowed. "What is it?" Wordlessly, she retrieved the box and handed it to him. Mark opened it and froze, his face pale as he stared at the key. This shouldn't exist," he whispered. "That's what I thought," Emily said, her voice cracking. "But it was here, in my apartment." Mark's jaw tightened. "It's a trick, a leftover fragment of whatever connection you had to the cabin. It's trying to pull you back." Emily shook her head. "No, it's more than that. I can feel it. It's not done with me." Mark paced the room, his hands running through his hair. "We destroyed it. The bond is severed. Whatever this is, it's not real. You can't let it get to you." Emily's voice rose, panic creeping in. "But it is real, Mark. I'm holding the key." He stopped, taking her hands in his. "Then we get rid of it. Right now. Burn it, bury it, whatever it takes." She nodded, desperate for the sense of finality she'd been chasing. They headed to the kitchen, where Mark grabbed a lighter and held it to the key. The flame licked at the metal, but it remained untouched, as though it absorbed the heat without consequence. Mark swore under his breath, his frustration mounting. "Okay, if fire doesn't work, we'll bury it, somewhere far from here." They drove out to a remote field just outside the city. The rain had stopped, leaving the ground damp and soft. Mark dug a shallow hole, and Emily placed the box inside, her fingers reluctant to let go of the key. "Say it," Mark urged her. Emily looked at him, confused. "Say what? Whatever it means to you. A declaration, a goodbye. Make it final." She swallowed hard, staring down at the box. "You don't own me anymore. I'm done with you. Stay buried." Mark covered the hole, patting the soil firmly before standing. "That's it. It's over." Emily wanted to believe him. They returned to her apartment, the ride quiet but tense. When she walked through the door, the air felt lighter, and for the first time in weeks, she thought she might finally sleep without fear. But that night, as she drifted off, her dreams were sharper, more vivid. She was standing in the clearing where the cabin had been, the soil freshly overturned. A low voice whispered her name, pulling her toward the ground. The dirt shifted, and the box emerged, pristine and untouched. The key floated upward, glowing faintly, before fitting itself into an invisible door. The cabin rose from the earth, its walls creaking as they rebuilt themselves, darker and more imposing than before. Emily screamed, trying to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The door opened, and the shadows inside beckoned her. She woke in a cold sweat, her heart racing. The first light of dawn streamed through her window, but the terror from her dream lingered. When she turned to check the time, her blood ran cold. The box sat on her nightstand, the key resting on top. She stared at it, her breath coming in short gasps. Mark's words echoed in her mind. You can't let it get to you. But it wasn't a matter of letting it. It was already here, demanding her attention. Emily grabbed the key, her hands trembling. This time, she wasn't going to wait for answers. She called Mark, her voice shaking as she explained what had happened. I'm coming over, he said. Don't touch it. Don't do anything until I get there. But as she hung up, the key seemed to pulse in her hand, a faint warmth radiating from it. Against her better judgment, she felt the urge to use it, to see where it might lead. Her thoughts twisted as the whispering began again, faint but insistent. Come home, Emily. You belong here. The door to her apartment creaked open, though no one stood on the other side. She clutched the key tighter, the pull toward the hallway growing stronger with each passing second. Mark's arrival broke the trance. He grabbed her shoulders, shaking her gently. Emily, focus. She blinked, the whispers fading as she looked at him. It's stronger than before. I don't know how to fight it. We'll find a way, Mark said, his voice resolute. But we have to act fast. As they stood in the dim light of her apartment, the shadows on the walls began to twist and shift, forming the unmistakable outline of the cabin's door. Whatever it wants, Mark said, we're not giving it. But deep down, Emily knew the cabin wasn't asking. It was taking. Mark and Emily stared at the shadowy outline of the door on her wall, its edges shimmering like heat waves on asphalt. The air in the apartment thickened, suffocating, as if the cabin had reached through dimensions to claim its place. What do we do? Emily asked, her voice trembling. Mark's jaw tightened. We don't let it win. If it's manifesting here, then we have the power to resist it. We just have to find the right way. Emily clutched the key, its metal burning cold against her skin. What if resisting isn't enough? What if it keeps coming back no matter what we do? Mark didn't answer right away. Instead, he grabbed his phone and started searching through contacts. There's someone I know, a friend of my uncle's. He deals with things like this, paranormal phenomena. He might be able to help. Emily felt a sliver of hope, but it was drowned out by the oppressive presence of the door. Its form grew more solid by the second, the faint outlines of wooden panels and an iron handle taking shape. Mark got through to his contact, his words terse and urgent. We need you now. Something is trying to anchor itself here. Can you come? After a brief exchange, he hung up and turned to Emily. He'll be here in 30 minutes. Until then, we need to stay strong. The cabin wasn't willing to wait. The shadows rippled, and the door groaned as it creaked open, revealing nothing but inky blackness inside. A faint, chilling wind flowed from it, carrying the unmistakable scent of damp wood and decay. Emily staggered back, her mind screaming at her to flee. But the key in her hand seemed to root her in place, its cold grip tightening as if fusing to her palm. A voice echoed from the darkness beyond the door, low and guttural. You should not have run, Emily. You belong with us. Mark grabbed her arm, pulling her back. Don't listen to it. Whatever it's saying, It's trying to weaken you." The voice chuckled, a hollow sound that reverberated through the room. "You think he can save you? He doesn't even understand what you are now." Emily's heart sank. The words struck a chord deep within her, dredging up fears she hadn't voiced. She turned to Mark, her eyes filled with doubt. What if it's right? What if I'm already too far gone? Mark shook his head fiercely. "No, this thing is lying to you, manipulating you. You're still you, Emily, and we'll fight this together." The door swung wider, and the faint outline of the cabin began to take shape through the darkness. It stood there, twisted and menacing, as if waiting for her to step inside. The pull grew stronger, almost irresistible, and Emily felt her feet inching forward despite herself. "Emily, stop." Mark's voice was sharp, snapping her out of the trance. He gripped her shoulders and forced her to look at him. "Listen to me. Whatever power it has, it's feeding off your fear. You have to fight it." Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "I don't know how." The cabin's voice grew louder, more insistent. "You do know. Deep down, you've always known. Stop fighting and come home." The key in her hand pulsed, its cold burn spreading through her arm. She could feel it connecting her to the cabin, like a thread that couldn't be severed. Mark took the key from her, his touch snapping the connection. He hurled it across the room, but instead of clattering to the floor, it hovered in the air, spinning slowly. The cabin laughed, a deep, echoing sound that filled the apartment. "You can't escape me, Emily. I am in you. I am you." Mark grabbed a kitchen knife and moved to the floating key. He slashed at it, but the blade stopped inches from the metal, repelled by an unseen force. "Damn it," he cursed, stepping back. "It's protecting itself. We need to find a way to sever its anchor." Emily's thoughts raced, memories of the cabin flashing in her mind. The ritual, the light, the whispers, it all pointed to one thing. The bond isn't with the key, it's with me. Mark turned to her, alarmed. "What are you saying?" She met his eyes, her voice steady despite the fear. "It's using me as its anchor. If we want to stop it, we have to break that connection." Mark shook his head. "No, there has to be another way. We can't risk." "There is no other way," she interrupted. "If we don't do this, it'll consume me, and then it'll come for you." The key spun faster, its glow intensifying as the cabin's voice roared. "Yes, Emily, accept your fate. Embrace what you are." Emily stepped forward, her hands trembling but resolute. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." Mark grabbed her arm, desperation in his eyes. "Emily, don't. We can find another way. Please." She placed her hand over his. "This is the only way. You have to trust me." The shadows around the door writhed violently as Emily approached the key. The cold radiating from it was almost unbearable, but she reached out, her fingers brushing against its surface. The world around her shifted. She was no longer in her apartment, but standing in the clearing, the cabin towering over her. Its twisted form loomed closer, its dark windows watching her. "You came back," the cabin whispered, its voice a mix of triumph and hunger. Emily stood her ground. "Not for you, for me." The key in her hand glowed brighter, its light piercing through the darkness. The cabin recoiled, its form flickering as if struggling to stay solid. You can't destroy me, it hissed. I am eternal. Emily raised the key, her voice steady and defiant. You're nothing without me, and I'm taking my life back. She plunged the key into the ground, and a blinding light erupted from it. The cabin screamed, its walls collapsing inward as the light consumed it. The clearing dissolved around her, the shadows retreating into nothingness. When Emily opened her eyes, she was back in her apartment. The door on the wall was gone, the key nowhere in sight. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight finally lifted. Mark rushed to her side, relief flooding his face. Emily, is it over? She nodded, a small smile breaking through her exhaustion. It's over. For the first time in weeks, she felt truly free. Emily stood in the silence of her apartment, the weight of everything that had transpired sinking in. The oppressive air had lifted, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lingering, just out of reach. She looked at Mark, who seemed equally relieved but concerned. Is it really over? He asked, his voice tentative. I think so, Emily replied, though uncertainty lingered in her tone. But I don't know for sure. There's still a part of me that feels like it's not done. Mark nodded, his expression serious. I get that. It's hard to let go of something like this. But you've done it, Emily. You've faced it. You're free now. Emily wasn't so sure. She had faced the cabin, fought it, and felt the key's grip break. But the darkness it had left in her mind was something that didn't just vanish overnight. She hadn't felt true peace in so long. But Mark was right in one thing. She had fought it, and she had won. Let's try to get some rest, Mark said, as if reading her thoughts. Tomorrow, we'll talk to the experts, find out how to ensure this doesn't come back. But tonight, let's just sleep. You deserve that. Emily didn't argue. She agreed, though she knew the road to true peace would be a long one. She followed him to her bedroom, the soft hum of the city outside her window the only sound in the otherwise still room. As they lay down, Emily felt her eyelids grow heavy, and her mind slowly started to drift into the embrace of sleep. But just before she succumbed to unconsciousness, she heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible over the sound of her breath. Come back. Her eyes shot open. The whisper wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. The voice was familiar, low, and full of malice, the same voice she had heard in the cabin. It sent a chill racing down her spine. Mark stirred beside her, unaware of the quiet whisper that had shaken her to the core. Emily held her breath, straining to hear, but it was gone, just as suddenly as it had appeared. The room felt colder, and she sat up, looking around. Her heart pounded in her chest. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly 3 a.m. She tried to steady her breathing, convinced that it was just the remnants of her nightmare, the echoes of the cabin's hold on her. But as she lay back down, her hand brushed against the side of her bed, and she froze. There, on the floor beside her, lay the key. The same tarnished, weathered key. Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't brought it with her into the room. She hadn't touched it since they buried it, since they thought they had destroyed it. Yet there it was, resting on the floor as if it had never left. No, she whispered, her voice trembling. No, no, no. The whispers returned, this time louder, clearer, filling the room with their sickening cadence. You belong here, Emily. Come back. It's never truly over. Mark was suddenly awake beside her. his eyes wide with concern. "Emily, what's wrong?" She reached for the key, her fingers brushing it with hesitation. "It's back. It's never gone. It's still here." Mark shot out of bed, his face pale. "We can't. It's impossible. We burned it. We buried it." But the key sat on the floor in front of them, untouched by time, by fire, by earth. It was like a scar on the world, an indelible mark that wouldn't fade. Emily stood up slowly, her legs weak beneath her. She felt dizzy, like the ground was shifting under her feet. "What's happening?" she murmured, her voice breaking. Mark grabbed her by the arm, pulling her away from the key. "Don't touch it. We need to leave. We need to go to the authorities. This isn't just a curse. There's something deeper happening here." But before they could take another step, the temperature in the room dropped. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through the walls, through their very bones. The walls seemed to warp and distort, the shadows growing longer, stretching toward them like dark fingers. Emily turned to Mark, but before she could speak, the lights flickered, casting strange, fleeting shadows. The door to her apartment creaked open, and there, standing in the doorway, was a figure, tall and cloaked, its face obscured by the hood of its dark cloak. Mark stepped back, his eyes wide with fear. "What is that?" The figure didn't respond, but Emily could feel its presence like a weight in the room. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything of this world. The whispers came again, louder now, rising to a crescendo that rattled her skull. "You can never escape, Emily. You belong to us." Emily backed away, her heart hammering in her chest. She was paralyzed, unable to move as the figure slowly advanced toward her. Every instinct told her to run, but her body betrayed her. Mark stood frozen beside her, staring at the figure with wide eyes. "What do you want from her?" he shouted, his voice trembling. The figure tilted its head slowly, as if considering the question. Then it spoke, its voice a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver through their bones. "Not from her. For her." The world around them seemed to tremble, and the shadows of the apartment deepened. The floor beneath their feet shifted, warping into the familiar, chilling darkness of the cabin's clearing. Emily gasped, her stomach dropping as the realization hit her. The cabin hadn't been destroyed. It had never truly left. The figure raised its hand, and the shadows obeyed, twisting and growing, forming the unmistakable shape of the cabin right before their eyes. "No," Emily whispered, backing away in terror. The figure's voice echoed in her mind, cold and unrelenting. "You cannot run from your own soul. You will return. You will always return." With that, Emily felt the floor give way beneath her. The earth parted, and she was falling into darkness, swallowed whole by the very thing she had tried to escape. Mark reached for her, but it was too late. Emily vanished into the depths of the cabin once again. Emily's heart raced as she plummeted into the darkness. The cold air seemed to consume her, pulling her deeper, faster, as the ground beneath her twisted and writhed. She couldn't scream, couldn't even gasp for air. She felt as though the very essence of her being was being torn apart, her body stretching and contorting in ways she couldn't understand. Then, without warning, she stopped. The darkness evaporated, and Emily was suddenly standing in a clearing, familiar yet foreign. The cold of the night bit at her skin, but the heavy silence around her was far worse than any chill. Before her stood the cabin, The same twisted, weathered structure that had haunted her dreams, her waking moments, had now reappeared in full form, its rotting wooden walls and shattered windows gleaming in the moonlight. She tried to move, to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. Every inch of her body felt like it was anchored to the earth, as if the ground itself was holding her in place. Then she heard it, the whisper, low and insistent, floating on the wind. "You thought you could escape," it said. "You thought you could leave me behind." Emily's breath caught in her throat. It was the voice. The same voice that had tormented her, whispered in her mind, twisted her thoughts. "You belong to me now, Emily," the voice continued, its tone growing darker. "This place is your home. You were always meant to return." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she couldn't stop herself from looking at the cabin. Its dark windows seemed to watch her, to judge her. She wanted to scream, to beg for help, but the words wouldn't form. It was as if the very air around her was choking her. In the distance, Mark's voice echoed, faint but clear. "Emily, Emily, where are you?" But Emily couldn't respond. She couldn't move, couldn't even turn her head. She was trapped in the cabin's grip. Suddenly, the figure appeared again. Its tall, dark silhouette materialized from the shadows, and its hooded face turned toward Emily. "It's not just a place, Emily," it spoke, its voice smooth and cold. "It's a part of you, and you're a part of it." The figure stepped closer, its footsteps silent on the earth. Emily tried to recoil, but the force that held her was too powerful. She was helpless, frozen, as the figure reached out, its long fingers brushing against her cheek. "You think you can escape your fate?" the figure asked, its voice dripping with malice. "You are mine. I've always been with you." The memories rushed back. Memories of the cabin, of the ritual, of the terror she had felt when she first discovered the truth. The key, the whispers, the pull. It had all been leading to this moment. Emily's chest tightened as she remembered the promise she had made to herself. To destroy the cabin, to sever the connection. But the key had returned. It hadn't been destroyed. And now, here she was, standing before the very thing she had tried to leave behind. "You can fight it," the figure said, its voice almost kind now. "But it won't change anything. You will always be tied to this place." Emily's mind screamed, but the words didn't come. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the figure, the whispers, the cabin, but nothing worked. She was drowning in it. Then, through the haze of despair, a flicker of light appeared. It was faint at first, but it grew stronger with each passing second. Emily's heart skipped a beat. The light. The same light she had seen when she first touched the key. The light that had burned away the shadows. The light that had destroyed the cabin once before. The figure turned, its expression darkening as the light grew brighter. "No, you cannot do this again." But Emily's resolve was stronger this time. She reached out, her hand trembling as she summoned the light. It was inside her now, a power she had once feared but now embraced. The cabin began to shake, its walls cracking, the shadows recoiling in terror. Emily felt the pull of the darkness, the whispers in her mind, but she fought it, calling forth the light with every ounce of strength she had. The figure hissed, its form flickering as if it were disintegrating. "You cannot banish me. I am eternal. I will always return." But Emily didn't stop. The light surged brighter and brighter until it engulfed everything. The cabin, the figure, the darkness. They were all consumed by the radiance. And then, with a final, deafening roar, the darkness shattered. The clearing, the cabin, and the figure were gone, leaving nothing but a vast, empty void in its place. Emily gasped for breath, her body trembling from the intensity of the battle. She looked around, but there was no sign of the cabin, no trace of the nightmare that had consumed her life. It was over. For the first time in what felt like forever, Emily was free. The world around her was silent. No whispers, no shadows, just peace. And as she stood there, in the aftermath of the battle, Emily knew that she had broken the cycle. The cabin was gone, and so was the darkness. But even as she stood there, victorious, she couldn't shake the feeling that the battle had taken more from her than she realized. She didn't know if she would ever be the same again. And as she turned to walk away from the void, she heard one last whisper, faint but unmistakable. "You will always be mine." But Emily didn't flinch. She walked on, knowing that she had won, knowing that she was finally free. The world around Emily was still. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating. She had faced the darkness, and she had won. Or so she thought. Her body felt exhausted, like she had fought a battle that took everything she had. And maybe she had. The memories of the cabin, the whispers, the figure, they seemed distant now, like a fading nightmare. But Emily knew better. She knew that darkness didn't just disappear. It lingered. It waited. As she took slow, deliberate steps away from the place where the cabin had once stood, she felt a strange tug in her chest, a sense of dread creeping back. She tried to shake it off, but it clung to her, like a shadow that wouldn't let go. The air around her was still. Not a single breeze stirred the trees. The moonlight was bright, casting an eerie glow on the barren landscape. Emily glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the cabin again, to feel its presence lurking just beyond the edge of the trees. But there was nothing. Still, that unsettling feeling remained. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She quickened her pace, hoping to outrun it, but the unease didn't fade. It was as if something was following her, something just out of reach, hiding in the shadows. Emily's footsteps echoed in the empty space, a constant reminder of her isolation. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt like she was walking through a dream, or maybe a nightmare. She didn't know how long she had been walking, but the landscape seemed to change as she moved. The trees were different now, twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The ground beneath her feet felt softer, as if the earth itself was shifting beneath her. And then she saw it, a figure, standing in the distance. At first, it was just a silhouette, but as she drew closer, she could see the outline of a man. Mark. Her heart leapt in her chest, a rush of relief flooding through her. She called his name, but the figure didn't respond. She ran toward him, her legs heavy with exhaustion, but as she neared him, she realized something was wrong. The figure was motionless, standing as if carved from stone. "Mark," she called again, her voice trembling. No answer. She reached out to touch him, but as her fingers brushed against his shoulder, he turned. His face was blank, emotionless, like a mask, and then his eyes met hers. But they weren't Mark's eyes. They were cold, empty, hollow. Emily stumbled back in horror. The figure before her was no longer Mark. It was a creature, an empty shell of something human. its face twisted into a grotesque parody of life. The thing opened its mouth, and Emily heard a voice that sounded like Mark's, but colder, more distant. "You can never escape," it whispered. "You belong to me, Emily. You always have." The world around her began to distort, the trees warping into unnatural shapes, the ground shaking beneath her. She fell to her knees, her hands gripping the earth as if she could hold on to something, anything, to keep herself grounded. And then, the earth opened up beneath her. She screamed, her voice echoing through the void, but no sound escaped her lips. She was falling, plummeting back into the darkness, into the place she thought she had left behind. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the figure standing at the edge of the void, its eyes locked onto hers, unblinking. "You can never escape," it repeated. "You will always belong to the darkness." The world around Emily collapsed into an overwhelming void, dark and suffocating, as she fell deeper and deeper into the abyss. Her body jerked with every moment, her hands grasping at the air as though she could somehow halt the descent. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat thundering in her ears. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the endless, crushing silence that seemed to wrap around her like a suffocating fog. The darkness was all-encompassing, its weight pressing down on her, suffusing her very thoughts with despair. It felt as though the walls of reality itself were closing in, each passing second eroding the very fabric of her existence. She had already faced this place once before, this void, this nightmare. The echoes of the whispers were distant now, but their malevolent presence lingered, like a shadow she couldn't outrun. And then, suddenly, there was light, a dim, flickering glow that cut through the blackness like a knife. It was faint at first, barely visible, but it was enough. It was the same light she had summoned before, the light that had been her only weapon against the cabin, against the figure that had once tormented her. Emily reached toward it instinctively, her fingers trembling as she stretched out into the emptiness. The light grew stronger, bathing her in its warm, pulsing glow. It was different this time, though. It didn't feel like a gift, like a promise of safety or escape. It felt more like a trap, a siren's call that could lead her to salvation or to destruction. Emily hesitated. The fear was overwhelming, paralyzing her as her mind screamed at her to stop, to turn away, but her body betrayed her. She had no choice. She had to follow the light. As she approached it, the ground beneath her feet solidified, the darkness receding. She was standing now, or at least, she felt like she was. The air around her shifted, cool and crisp, and the faint sound of rain began to fall, a soft pattering against the earth. The environment around her began to take shape. Trees, distant hills, the familiar clearing she had been in before. It was the same place, yet it felt different now. The cabin was no longer in front of her, but Emily could still sense its presence. It was lurking somewhere beyond the edge of her awareness, just out of sight. She knew it was waiting for her, just as it had waited before. The whispers returned, faint and distant, like the wind rustling through the trees. "You thought you could escape," the voice said, low and taunting. "But it's always been here. It never left." Emily turned sharply, scanning the clearing, but saw no one. She was alone, or so she thought. The air around her seemed to thicken, the world growing heavier, more oppressive. She could feel the weight of the place pressing down on her once again, and for the first time in what felt like ages, she could almost hear the heartbeat of the earth beneath her feet. It was rhythmic, steady, like the pulse of something ancient, something alive. The light flickered once again, and Emily's attention snapped back to it. This time, it was stronger, brighter, and it illuminated a figure standing in the distance. It was tall, cloaked, its face hidden in shadow. The figure didn't move, but its presence was undeniable, a cold chill emanating from it that made the hairs on the back of Emily's neck stand on end. "You can't run anymore," the figure spoke, its voice low, deep, and insidious. It didn't need to raise its voice to command her attention. The words wrapped around Emily's mind, tightening like a vice. "I've already run. I've already fought," she replied, her voice shaky but defiant. "You think you've won?" the figure asked, stepping forward slowly, its movements deliberate. "You can't escape what you are. You belong to this place. You always have." The figure reached up, pulling back its hood. Emily gasped in horror as the face of the creature was revealed. It wasn't marked, not even close. The face was a twisted mockery of humanity, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight through her. Its lips curled into a twisted smile. "You can't escape yourself, Emily," the figure said, its voice now a sickly whisper that seemed to echo from every direction. "You will always come back. It's in your blood." Emily staggered back, her mind reeling as the weight of the figure's words pressed in on her. The rain continued to fall, soft and steady, but she couldn't shake the sense that it was now more than just rain. It was the sound of the earth weeping, of the very ground crying out in mourning. "Why?" Emily gasped, her voice trembling. "Why me? Why this place?" The figure's smile widened, an expression of pure malice. "Because, Emily, you were always meant to return. The cabin calls to you. It is your birthright. You were born to carry its darkness, to live with it, to become it." The wind picked up, swirling around her, whipping her hair around her face. The figure's eyes locked onto hers, and for a brief moment, Emily felt herself drawn into them, her will crumbling beneath their weight. But then something inside her snapped. She couldn't give in. She wouldn't give in. With a fierce, guttural cry, Emily pushed forward, summoning every ounce of strength she had left. The light flared again, brighter and hotter than before, and for a split second, the figure recoiled, its form wavering as if it were made of smoke. Emily took a step forward, then another, her feet steady as she moved closer to the figure. "You have no power over me," she shouted, her voice ringing out like a challenge. The figure's expression twisted into something darker, angrier. "You think you're free," it hissed. "You are nothing. You can't escape what you are." But Emily stood tall, her body humming with the energy of the light she had summoned. She wasn't going to be the one to fall this time. The figure lunged toward her, its hands outstretched, but Emily was faster. The light burst from her in a blinding wave, engulfing everything in its path. The figure screamed as it was consumed by the radiance, its form dissolving into the very air around her. And then, just like that, it was gone. The clearing fell silent. The rain continued to fall softly, but the weight, the oppressive darkness that had held her captive, was gone. Emily stood in the stillness, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had done it. She had defeated it. The nightmare was over, or so she thought. As the rain continued to fall, Emily felt a coldness settle deep inside her, something she couldn't shake. The figure's words echoed in her mind, reverberating with a chilling truth she couldn't ignore. "You can never escape." The words haunted her as she stood there, unsure of what came next. The battle was over, but the war inside her, was just beginning. The rain continued to pour around Emily, its rhythmic sound lulling her into a dazed state. She couldn't quite process what had just happened. The figure, the light, the way everything had collapsed into a single burst of energy. Was it really over? Her mind screamed for clarity, but the silence of the clearing pressed down on her like a weight. There was no sound of the wind, no whispers of the trees, just the incessant patter of the rain against the earth. It felt almost peaceful, yet something gnawed at her. Something wasn't right. She stood alone, staring at the empty space where the figure had been, wondering if perhaps it had all been a trick of her mind. A lingering hallucination from the darkness that had gripped her for so long. But no, she could still feel the coldness in the air, the oppressive weight of the place, like an invisible hand pressing on her chest. "Get out before it's too late," a voice whispered. Emily's heart raced. She turned sharply, scanning the clearing for the source. Her breath caught in her throat. There, in the distance, was a figure standing at the edge of the trees. It wasn't the same as before, but it was unmistakable. She tried to take a step forward, but her legs refused to obey. It was as if her body was locked in place, paralyzed by the very fear that had haunted her for so long. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. The rain intensified, the droplets now slapping her skin like ice. The figure's eyes seemed to glimmer with malice, and Emily realized with horror that she wasn't free after all. She turned, desperate to flee, but no matter where she looked, the cabin's dark shadow loomed in the distance. The darkness had returned. Emily's heart raced as she stood frozen, the figure in the distance an unblinking presence in the corner of her eye. The rain fell harder, almost violently, drenching her with its cold bite. Every drop seemed to hit her with the force of the figure's cold gaze. She didn't know what it wanted, but deep down, she knew she couldn't stay. She couldn't let herself be drawn back into whatever nightmare had first brought her to this cursed place. Her legs felt like lead, but the urgency of the moment spurred her forward. She took a trembling step, then another, trying to fight the dread that crept over her like a blanket suffocating her. The ground beneath her feet felt wrong, soft, like it was shifting with every step she took. The trees surrounding her, once familiar, now looked twisted and menacing, their branches stretching out like clawed hands reaching for her. She was surrounded, and no matter where she turned, she felt the pull of something watching, waiting. "Leave now," the voice whispered again, louder this time. It was distant, echoing from somewhere beyond her vision, but the sound was unmistakable. A deep, guttural tone, like a warning from the very earth itself. Emily's heart skipped a beat as the figure moved. It didn't walk. It glided, a slow, deliberate motion that sent chills racing up her spine. It didn't come closer. No, it didn't need to. It was as if it was guiding her, leading her back toward the one place she'd hoped to escape, the cabin. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to run, but the pull was too strong. The figure's presence seemed to suffocate the very air around her, tightening her chest and making each breath feel like a struggle. "Not again," she muttered under her breath, her voice breaking. She wanted to scream, to run, but every fiber of her being felt as though it was being held captive by the figure's will. There was no escape. The figure raised one hand, and Emily froze. The movement was subtle, yet it felt like a command, a silent request for her to follow. The weight of its gaze pressed on her with the intensity of 1,000 eyes, but she couldn't turn away. It was as if the air had thickened around her, and all she could do was stand still, like a puppet with invisible strings. As the figure gestured, the ground before her began to shift. It cracked open with a sound like bones snapping, and from the depths of the earth, a light began to glow. A pale, sickly glow that pulsed like a heartbeat, beckoning her toward the darkness. It was like a portal, a gaping wound in the earth, waiting for her to step through. "No," Emily whispered, shaking her head as she tried to take a step back, her body still unwilling to obey her commands. The portal seemed to draw her in, pulling her like a magnet, and despite every instinct she had to run, she couldn't help herself. Her feet moved on their own, each step feeling heavier than the last, as though the earth itself was resisting her progress. But she couldn't stop. She felt like a marionette caught in the strings of the darkness, each step carrying her closer to the very place she had tried to leave behind. The cabin. The moment her foot touched the threshold of the light, the ground beneath her feet gave way entirely. She tumbled, falling with no sense of direction, spinning through the air as though gravity had no hold on her. It was like the entire world had fractured, leaving her suspended in nothingness. Her lungs burned, her heart racing, but the moment she hit the ground, she felt a coldness unlike anything she had experienced before. It wasn't the cold of the rain or the chill of the wind. It was the cold of the cabin, the cold of the entity that had haunted her every step since she first arrived. Emily's body jerked upright, a jolt of panic coursing through her as she tried to regain control. Her eyes shot open, and she was back. She was back at the cabin. The same broken-down, decaying building that had twisted her mind and shredded her sense of reality. The walls were covered in rot. The floor beneath her cracked and unstable, and the air was thick with the stench of mildew and decay. But it was different this time. This time, she could feel it. The darkness was alive. It pulsed in the walls, in the air, in the very ground beneath her feet. It was waiting. "You can't run from this," the voice said again, now clearer than ever. It was no longer distant, no longer a whisper in the wind. It was right behind her, its breath cold on her neck. Emily spun around, her eyes scanning the room for the source of the voice. But there was nothing. Nothing but the rotting wood of the cabin and the feeling of something, someone, watching her from the shadows. "No," she said, her voice gaining strength despite the terror clawing at her throat. "I won't let you win." But her words felt weak, even to her own ears. The darkness inside the cabin didn't care about her resistance. It had been here long before her arrival, and it would be here long after she was gone. The light from the portal flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls, and Emily saw something move within them. A figure, familiar yet distorted. It was her, but it wasn't. The version of her that stood before her was twisted, her body bent at unnatural angles, her face contorted into a grotesque mask of fear. The figure smiled, its teeth sharp and gleaming, its eyes empty, hollow. "You think you can escape?" the figure whispered. "You are me. I am you. We are bound by this place." The air around Emily grew thick, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. The room seemed to shrink, the shadows creeping closer, pressing in on her from all sides. The darkness was no longer just a presence. It was a living, breathing entity that was inside her, coursing through her veins. It was part of her now. "No," Emily whispered again, but the words had no power. The figure, her twisted reflection, stepped forward, its form becoming more solid with each passing second. "You belong here," it said, its voice growing louder, stronger. "You were always meant to return, and now you will never leave." The darkness around her swelled, and Emily felt her strength falter. Her vision blurred, and everything around her became distorted, warped by the suffocating grip of the entity that had claimed the cabin. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the darkness collapsed around her. Everything went black. Emily's eyes fluttered open, her body still trembling, as if she had just woken from a terrible dream. But this wasn't a dream. This was real. She could still feel the weight of the darkness pressing against her chest, suffocating her with its presence. The cabin around her was still in its decayed, rotten state, but now it felt different. The air was thick with something otherworldly, something ancient and vile. She slowly pushed herself to her feet, her head spinning. The walls seemed to pulse with the same eerie energy that had been with her all this time. It was as if the cabin itself was alive, breathing in time with the very essence of the darkness that had claimed it. Emily shook her head, trying to clear the fog in her mind. She had to get out. There had to be a way to escape. But as she stumbled toward the door, the whispers returned. Soft at first, like the sound of wind rustling through the trees. Then louder, clearer, until they filled her ears with their maddening insistence. "You can't leave. You can't escape." The voice was not a man's, nor a woman's. It was a whisper, a hiss, as though it were coming from the very walls themselves. A voice that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere all at once. It sounded like her own thoughts, but twisted, corrupted by the dark energy of the cabin. "No," Emily whispered to herself, trying to block it out. This isn't real. I won't listen. I won't fall for it again." Her pulse quickened as she turned toward the door, but it was no longer there. The frame was empty, a gaping hole where the door had once been. Her breath caught in her throat as the realization sank in. The cabin had closed in on her once again. She backed away slowly, her mind racing. She had to find a way out. There had to be a way to escape this nightmare, but the longer she stayed here, the more she could feel the darkness creeping into her very soul. It was like a poison, spreading through her veins, turning her thoughts to whispers of fear and doubt. "No," she repeated, clenching her fists at her sides. "I won't let it win. I won't become part of this place." But her words felt weak. The weight of the darkness seemed to push against her, wrapping around her like chains, pulling her deeper into the nightmare. She could feel it now, crawling beneath her skin, scratching at the edges of her mind, trying to take hold of her once again. It wasn't just the cabin. It was her. The darkness was inside her, feeding on her fear, on her desperation. She could feel it, the tendrils of it wrapping around her heart, tightening with each passing second. The floor beneath her feet shifted, groaning as though it were alive. Emily stumbled, catching herself on the nearest wall, her heart racing. She couldn't let it consume her. She had to fight back. With every ounce of strength she could muster, she pushed forward, moving through the room, desperately searching for something, anything that could help her escape. Her mind kept circling back to the figure, the one she had seen before, the one that had told her she couldn't escape. It had been so sure of itself, so confident that she would fail. It had been right about so many things. "Not this time," Emily muttered, gritting her teeth. "Not this time." But as she reached the corner of the room, something caught her eye. A figure stood in the doorway, silent, unmoving, but unmistakable. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as she recognized the shape. It was the twisted reflection of herself, the same one she had seen before, standing in front of her with its empty, hollow eyes. Its face was contorted into a grotesque grin, the skin stretched too tight across its skull, like it had been pulled out of shape. The smile was twisted, mocking. The figure didn't need to speak. Its presence was enough to send a chill down Emily's spine. "You still think you can escape?" the figure whispered, its voice a mirror of Emily's own, but colder, darker. "You've always been part of this place, Emily. You were never meant to leave." "No," Emily breathed, shaking her head. "No, I won't. I won't let you take me." The figure didn't move, but its eyes seemed to pierce her, digging into her very soul. It felt as though it was reading her, unraveling her thoughts, her emotions, tearing them apart and putting them back together in the shape it desired. The darkness was still inside her, and it was feeding off her fear, her anger, her desperation. It was getting stronger, closer. She could feel it. "You can't fight this," the figure hissed, its voice growing darker. "You are nothing. You were never meant to be free." Emily stepped back, her eyes searching the room for an escape, but there was none. The walls seemed to press in on her, the ceiling lowering, the floor shifting beneath her feet. The cabin had become a living, breathing entity, closing in around her. "No," Emily said, her voice trembling but determined. "I won't let you take me." With every ounce of willpower, she pushed forward. She didn't know how, but something inside her sparked. A tiny flicker of resistance that refused to be extinguished. She had to keep fighting. For herself. For Mark. For everyone who had been lost to this place. The figure stepped closer, its smile widening, but Emily refused to falter. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, taking a deep breath, gathering what little strength she had left. Then, as though summoned by her defiance, a soft glow appeared, flickering in the corner of the room. Emily's eyes snapped open, and she turned toward the light. It was faint at first, just a glimmer, but it grew stronger with every heartbeat. The light was her only chance. It had helped her before, and it would help her again. She stepped toward it, her body moving with newfound strength. The figure screamed in frustration, but Emily didn't look back. The light was growing brighter, enveloping her in its warmth. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the light, and for a brief moment, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. And then, in an instant, the darkness shattered. The light consumed everything. The cabin, the figure, the suffocating weight of the darkness. It was all gone. The room was silent once more. The rain had stopped. The air was clear. The suffocating pressure lifted. Emily stood alone in the clearing. She was no longer in the cabin, no longer trapped in the nightmare. The oppressive weight of the darkness was gone. The whispers had ceased. She had won. She was free. But as she looked around, she couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness had only been waiting for her to slip, waiting for her to return. And in that quiet stillness, Emily realized something far more terrifying. The battle wasn't over. The silence hung thick in the air, heavy and oppressive, as Emily stood alone in the clearing. The rain had stopped, and the clouds that had once cloaked the sky in darkness were beginning to dissipate. The first rays of dawn peeked through the trees, casting a faint light on the ground. But there was no warmth in it, no comfort. The calm felt unnatural, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Emily's heart was still racing, her mind reeling from what she had just escaped. The cabin was gone. The darkness was gone, or so she thought. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking, watching her from the shadows. Even now, as she stood in the middle of the clearing, the air around her felt thick with an unseen presence. She took a cautious step forward, her feet crunching on the wet ground. She didn't know where she was anymore. The forest seemed endless, its trees stretching far into the distance, as though they were closing in on her. The path she had taken to reach the cabin no longer existed. There was no sign of the clearing she had just been in, no trace of the nightmarish structure that had tormented her. But despite the emptiness of the place, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The sense of being watched, of something just beyond her reach, crept up on her once again. A sudden rustle in the bushes snapped her back to reality. Her breath caught in her throat as she spun toward the sound, her pulse spiking. For a moment, all was still. The wind had died down, and the only noise was the distant drip of water from the trees. Nothing. She was alone. But Emily wasn't so sure. She could feel it. Something was out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Her skin prickled with unease as she looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. She had left the cabin, escaped its grip, but it was as though it had never let her go. The darkness, the terror, it was still inside her, lurking just beneath the surface. As she took another step, the ground beneath her feet shifted, and a low growl echoed from deep within the forest. It was a sound that sent a jolt of fear through her, a primal warning that something was coming. She froze, her eyes darting in every direction, searching for the source of the noise. Then, the trees ahead of her parted, and a figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't human. Its body was tall and gaunt, its skin pale and stretched tightly over its bones. Its eyes were black pits, hollow and empty, staring directly at her. It had no mouth, no nose, just a featureless face that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. The figure didn't move toward her. It simply stood there, watching her, its presence sending waves of dread crashing through her body. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she slowly took a step back. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. It was like the figure was holding her in place, forcing her to face it, to face whatever nightmare it represented. "You can't escape," the voice whispered. It was the same voice from the cabin, the one that had haunted her every step. The voice of the darkness that had claimed her, that had twisted her reality and made her question everything she knew. Emily felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine as the figure raised a hand, its long, skeletal fingers reaching toward her. The air around her grew colder, and she could feel the darkness closing in once again. It was suffocating, like a weight pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. "You belong here," the figure murmured. "You were always meant to be part of this." "No," Emily whispered, shaking her head. She couldn't let it happen again. She couldn't let herself fall back into the nightmare. She had escaped once, and she could do it again. With a burst of adrenaline, Emily turned and ran. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away from the figure, away from the darkness. Her legs burned as she pushed through the underbrush, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how fast she ran, The feeling of being chased never left her. The darkness was following her, like a shadow she couldn't shake. She glanced over her shoulder and saw the figure still standing there, its hollow eyes fixed on her, its presence closing in with every passing second. Emily's heart thudded in her chest, her panic rising with each step. She couldn't outrun it. She couldn't outrun the darkness that had already claimed her. And then, the ground beneath her feet cracked. Emily stumbled, her ankle twisting as she fell to the ground with a sharp cry. She tried to push herself up, but her body wouldn't cooperate. The pain was too much, the terror too overwhelming. She couldn't move. The figure was closer now, its skeletal form looming over her, its cold eyes never leaving hers. It reached down with its long, bony fingers, and as it touched her, she felt a jolt of icy cold shoot through her body. "You are mine," it whispered. Emily screamed, but no sound escaped her lips. The world around her blurred, her vision fading, as if the darkness was swallowing her whole. And then, just as quickly as it had come, everything stopped. The ground beneath her was solid once again, the air warm and still. The figure was gone. The forest was quiet. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, but there was no longer any sign of the creature, no sign of the darkness. She didn't know what had happened. She didn't know if it was real or just another illusion. But as she lay there in the silence, she realized one terrifying truth. She was never truly free. The darkness was a part of her now, and no matter where she went, it would always be there, waiting, watching. Emily closed her eyes, knowing that the nightmare was far from over. Emily lay in the silence, her breath coming in shaky gasps as the last remnants of the nightmare faded into the quiet forest. The ground beneath her was soft, the scent of earth and damp leaves filling the air. She wanted to believe that the figure had been a figment of her imagination, a lingering manifestation of the darkness that had tormented her. But deep down, she knew the truth. The darkness wasn't gone. It had simply changed form. Her fingers trembled as she pushed herself to her feet, the weight of her twisted reality pressing down on her. The forest was still, too still, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for the next move. She glanced around, trying to make sense of where she was, but the trees seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, their silhouettes stark against the dim light of the early morning. Something wasn't right. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she took a few hesitant steps forward. The feeling of being watched was back, sharper now, more oppressive. She couldn't shake the sensation that the very forest itself was alive, its trees whispering secrets she wasn't meant to hear. And then, from somewhere deep within the woods, she heard it, a faint, distant sound. A voice, soft and slow, like a song carried by the wind. "You can't run." Emily froze, her blood running cold. The voice was the same one she had heard in the cabin, the one that had haunted her every step. It was here again, nearer than before. The trees shifted, and in the distance, she saw a shadow move, too quick to be natural, like a wisp of smoke caught in the wind. Her body tensed, her instincts screaming at her to run, to get away before it was too late. But there was no escape now. The darkness had her, and this time it wasn't letting go. Emily's heart raced as the shadow moved again, this time closer. It was barely visible, but she could feel it, the weight of its presence pressing against her, suffocating her with its silence. The forest had gone unervingly quiet, as if it, too, was holding its breath. She could almost hear the thudding of her own heartbeat in the stillness. She took a cautious step back, her mind racing for an escape, for anything that could save her. But the forest felt endless now, each tree like a prison, trapping her deeper with every move. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The voice returned, low and mocking. You can't run. It's already inside you. Emily's hands trembled as she clutched at her sides, trying to steady herself. She wanted to scream, to shout, but the words caught in her throat. It was like the air itself was thick with fear, preventing her from calling out for help. The shadow moved again, this time closer than ever, and Emily could almost see it. Dark, formless, a shape that seemed to shift through the trees. It was like the forest itself had become part of it, wrapping her in its suffocating embrace. You'll never escape me, the voice whispered again, closer this time, right behind her. Emily turned sharply, her body frozen in terror. But there was nothing there. Nothing but the trees, the soft rustle of leaves, and the unshakable sense that she was not alone. And in that moment, she realized with a jolt of horror, the darkness wasn't something that followed her. It was something she carried within. Emily's breath quickened as the realization sank in. The darkness wasn't just out there, lurking in the forest. It was inside her, feeding off her fear, twisting her thoughts. It had always been a part of her, a shadow she couldn't escape no matter how far she ran. She staggered backward, her hands pressed to her ears, trying to block out the whispers that grew louder with each passing second. You'll never be free, they hissed. You belong to me. Tears blurred her vision as she squeezed her eyes shut. She had fought so hard, so desperately, to escape. But now, in the depths of the forest, in the midst of the nightmare that had consumed her, she wasn't sure anymore if there was even an escape at all. The forest around her seemed to close in, the trees pressing forward, their gnarled branches reaching out like fingers, as if they too had become part of the entity chasing her. The shadows stretched and twisted, shifting unnaturally in the dim light. Emily felt it again, the presence behind her, just out of reach. She could sense it, hear it, the weight of it pressing down on her, suffocating her, urging her to give in. She couldn't stop herself from trembling. But then, through the fear and the whispers, a single thought pierced through: fight. She couldn't let it win. Not now. Not after everything she had already endured. With a final, desperate cry, Emily pushed forward, forcing herself to move despite the terror clenching her chest. She wouldn't let the darkness take her. Not today. The forest around Emily seemed to close in tighter with every step she took, its trees pressing forward like they were alive, like they were part of the darkness that followed her. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of wet leaves and something darker, something ancient that lurked just beneath the surface of the earth. She could feel it, the weight of the forest, the weight of her fear, all of it building, suffocating her. She stumbled forward, her legs aching with exhaustion, but she couldn't stop. She had to keep moving, had to escape. Her breath was ragged, her chest heaving with each gasping inhale. The whispers were growing louder, almost deafening now, each one a taunting reminder of her helplessness. You'll never get away from me. The voice was everywhere, in the rustle of the leaves, in the snapping of twigs under her feet, in the very pulse of the earth beneath her. It was all around her, surrounding her, echoing in her mind. It was the same voice she had heard in the cabin, the one that had promised to claim her, to consume her, and now it was here again, as if it had never left. Her eyes darted around, desperately searching for something, anything that could help her. But the forest was endless, stretching on in every direction. There was no way out, no way to escape. Her heart hammered in her chest, her hands trembling as she wiped away the sweat that had beaded on her brow. The darkness was closing in on her, tightening its grip with every passing second. She could feel it wrapping itself around her, seeping into her thoughts, twisting her emotions. She could hear it, feel it, a cold presence deep inside her. The cabin had been just the beginning. It had taken root within her, and now it was pulling her back, dragging her toward the same fate she had just escaped. The ground beneath her shifted again, the earth cracking and shifting as if it were alive. Emily gasped as the ground beneath her feet gave way, and she tumbled forward, her body hitting the ground hard. Her face scraped against the dirt, her palms skidding across the ground as she tried to catch herself. For a moment, all was still. The forest was quiet again, as if it had never been alive with whispers and shadows. But Emily knew better. She could still feel it, that suffocating presence pressing in on her from all sides. It was waiting, watching, just beyond her reach. She pushed herself up, her body aching from the fall, but the adrenaline coursing through her veins kept her moving. She had no choice but to keep going. She had to find a way out. She had to find a way to escape this nightmare once and for all. Her feet slid on the wet earth, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but she kept moving. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly around her, their branches reaching down like skeletal hands, pulling her deeper into the forest. The whispers were louder now, more insistent, a constant presence in the back of her mind. "You can't escape," the voice murmured again. So close now it felt like it was inside her head. "You belong to me. You always have." Emily's chest tightened at the words, her breath coming in shallow bursts as the weight of the darkness pressed harder against her. It was trying to take her again, to pull her into the same suffocating grip that had held her in the cabin. She couldn't let it. She wouldn't. But the forest was changing. The trees seemed to warp and twist, their shapes becoming more grotesque, more unnatural. The air was thick with something foul, something ancient and dark. Emily could feel it, like a pulse in the earth, a rhythmic thrum that seemed to echo in her bones. She stopped, her heart racing, her senses on high alert. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. The wind had died down, leaving nothing but the faint sound of her own breathing. She could feel the presence again, hovering just at the edge of her perception. Something was out there, watching her, waiting. The sudden sound of footsteps behind her froze Emily in place. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned sharply, but there was nothing. Nothing but the trees, the endless rows of trunks, their dark silhouettes like silent sentinels. She shook her head, trying to clear the fog of fear clouding her mind. The darkness had been toying with her, pushing her to the edge. It was playing with her, feeding on her panic. She couldn't let it win. She couldn't let herself be consumed again. But the footsteps came again, closer this time, a slow, deliberate pace. Emily's pulse quickened as she turned, her body moving before her mind could process what was happening. She couldn't see it, but she could hear it, the soft padding of feet on the wet ground, the steady rhythm of something approaching her. She ran. Her legs burned with the effort, her muscles screaming in protest as she pushed herself harder, faster. The footsteps behind her were relentless, following her every move, growing closer with every step. She couldn't stop. She couldn't let it catch her. And then, through the trees ahead, she saw it. The clearing. The same clearing from before, the one where the cabin had once stood. The spot where she had first encountered the darkness. The footsteps were louder now, a pounding sound, almost deafening. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and decay. Emily pushed harder, her breath ragged as she neared the center of the clearing. She didn't know why, but something told her that if she could just reach the heart of the clearing, she might find a way to stop the darkness. She had to try. But when she stepped into the center of the clearing, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift once again. The earth cracked, splitting open like a wound. She stumbled, her hands reaching out to steady herself, but it was too late. The ground gave way beneath her, and she fell. The darkness had her. Emily fell, the ground beneath her crumbling away like brittle paper. She gasped, her arms flailing desperately as she tried to catch herself. But the air was thick with terror, and nothing she did could stop her descent. The darkness, that ever-present force, seemed to pull her downward, deeper into the earth. It wasn't just the ground that was collapsing. It was her very sense of reality, of time, of her own identity. Everything was blurring, disintegrating into the shadows that surrounded her. The fall felt endless. Her body jerked and twisted as the earth gave way beneath her, the coldness of the dark soil closing in. She tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the void. Her mind was racing, spinning with thoughts that she couldn't grasp, as though the very fabric of her consciousness was unraveling with each passing second. Finally, she landed with a sickening thud, her body slamming into something soft yet unfamiliar. Damp earth mixed with something colder, slicker. She groaned in pain, trying to sit up, but her limbs felt heavy, like lead. The darkness pressed in all around her, a suffocating weight that clung to her skin, seeped into her very soul. She was in a cavern, she realized, the walls of the earth jagged and uneven. The faintest glimmer of light barely illuminated the space, enough to reveal twisted roots that sprawled across the floor like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with moisture and decay, and she could feel the oppressive weight of something ancient, something forgotten, watching her. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps as she pushed herself to her knees, trying to make sense of her surroundings. There was no way out, no exit, just walls, roots, and darkness. She was trapped, confined in this place beneath the earth, and the worst part was that she knew the darkness wasn't just in the cavern. It was inside her, too, pulsing with the rhythm of her own heartbeat, entwining itself with her thoughts. A sound broke the silence, sharp and sudden. A faint rustling, like something moving in the shadows, something small, but no less terrifying. Emily's pulse quickened. She wasn't alone. A figure stepped into the dim light. A silhouette. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the shadows, but then it moved again, its form becoming clearer. It was human. No, not quite. The face was pale, too pale, with dark hollow eyes that glowed faintly, like embers in the night. Its skin was stretched tight across its bones, as if it had been drained of light, of warmth. Emily recoiled, her back hitting the cavern wall as she scrambled backward, fear flooding her veins. "Help me," the figure whispered, its voice a raspy, hollow sound that seemed to echo from all directions. Emily's breath hitched, her heart racing in her chest as the figure took a step forward, its limbs moving too stiffly, too mechanically. It stopped, tilting its head as if trying to understand her reaction. "Please," it repeated, its eyes locked onto hers, its gaze unervingly calm, despite the grotesque form it wore. What are you?" Emily managed to croak, her voice hoarse, trembling. The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it seemed to study her, its hollow eyes narrowing as if weighing her every word. Finally, it spoke again, its voice quieter now. "You are one of us now," it said, its words dripping with a kind of sorrow, as if it too had once been human and had long since forgotten what it was like to feel warmth, to feel alive. Emily's mind reeled, the weight of its words crashing into her. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I'm not one of you." But deep down, she felt the truth of what it was saying. She had been marked, chosen. This place, this darkness, it had been with her all along, feeding on her, bending her, until there was no escape. It had always been part of her, waiting for her to return. The figure took another slow step forward, its head tilting to the side as if studying her with renewed interest. "You cannot escape," it said softly, almost kindly. "You belong here, with us, in the depths, where we all return." Emily's throat tightened as she backed away, her hands scrabbling against the cold, damp walls. Her mind screamed for her to run, to get away, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness had swallowed everything. Another rustle broke the silence. More figures emerged from the shadows, moving with the same stiff, unnatural gait as the first. They surrounded her, their hollow eyes fixed on her, their faces pale and twisted. Each one was like the first, a warped reflection of humanity, drained of all warmth and life. "You're not real," Emily muttered, her voice breaking as she scrambled back against the wall, her mind desperately trying to convince her that this wasn't happening. But deep down, she knew, these figures, they weren't just figments of her imagination. They were something worse, something that had always been here, in the shadows, waiting for her. The figures closed in, their pale faces twisted with sorrow, with hunger. They didn't speak again. Their silence was deafening, 1,000 unspoken words hanging in the air. They didn't need to say anything more. Emily could feel it now. The darkness was all around her, pressing in from every side. It had claimed her, and there was no escaping it. The last thing Emily heard before everything went black was the soft, raspy whisper of the first figure. "Welcome home." The darkness consumed her senses, pressing in from every side. Emily could no longer feel the ground beneath her feet, the cold dampness of the cavern, or the shadows of the figures that had surrounded her. Everything was fading, like she was slipping into a void, a place where there were no boundaries, no limits, just an endless, all-encompassing blackness. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but it felt as if her very voice had been stolen. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her body felt weightless, like it was no longer her own, detached from her mind. She was drifting, lost, helpless. The darkness didn't just surround her now. It was inside her, suffocating her, crawling beneath her skin. She tried to reach out, to grasp onto something solid, something familiar, but the void only deepened. Her fingers brushed against the cold nothingness, and with every touch, she felt herself becoming less and less real, like she was being erased from existence. Her thoughts were slipping away, too. Memories fading, faces blurring, all the things that had once mattered slipping through her fingers like sand. Then she felt it. A sudden pressure in the air, a weight that made her lungs ache, as if she was being pulled downward, deeper into the earth. Her body jerked, her limbs moving instinctively, trying to fight the pull, but it was futile. The darkness was in control now. She could feel it, its cold fingers wrapping around her mind, its grip tightening, drawing her into its depths. Her vision cleared for a moment, a fleeting glimpse of something familiar. A cabin. Her heart skipped a beat. No, it couldn't be. The cabin. The place where it all began. The place she thought she had escaped. But now, it felt like it was waiting for her, a silent, patient observer, watching her from the edges of her mind. The figures from before, they were there, too, surrounding the cabin, standing motionless, their hollow eyes fixed on her. They weren't real, she told herself. This couldn't be happening. But her legs moved of their own accord, bringing her closer to the cabin, as if she was being drawn toward it by some invisible force. She reached out, her hand trembling as it hovered above the door. Her breath caught in her throat as the door slowly creaked open, revealing the familiar, decaying interior. The scent of rot and dust filled her nostrils, but it was strangely comforting, like a twisted homecoming. The floor creaked beneath her feet as she stepped inside, the walls closing in around her, the air thick with the weight of memories. Memories that weren't her own, memories that had been twisted and warped by the darkness. It was all there, the cabin, the shadows, the figures, everything. "You've come back," a voice whispered from the corner, one she recognized as the voice of the first figure. It was soft, almost tender, as if it were welcoming her home. Emily's pulse quickened, her stomach twisting with a sickening sense of dread. This wasn't where she was supposed to be. This place, this nightmare, it wasn't real. She had to get out, she had to. But the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. The sound echoed through the empty cabin, the finality of it sinking into her bones. "You belong to us now," the voice said again, the words hollow and cold. "You always have." Emily stumbled back, her mind racing. Oh, this wasn't possible. She had fought so hard to escape. She couldn't have come back. The darkness couldn't have pulled her back here. Not again. But as the figures stepped forward from the shadows, she realized the truth. She never had left. The cabin, the forest, the darkness, it had been inside her all along, just waiting for the right moment to claim her. The figures circled her, their hollow eyes never leaving her. She wanted to scream, to fight, but the darkness was overwhelming, consuming her from the inside out. She could feel it, its cold tendrils curling around her heart, squeezing the life out of her. It was a part of her now, just as she was a part of it. "You're one of us," the first figure said, its voice almost affectionate now, like a twisted mother welcoming her child home. "And now you will never leave." Emily's mind screamed, but the words wouldn't come. Her body was frozen, her senses dulling. She was being pulled under, drawn into the very essence of the darkness, until there was nothing left of her but the echo of her own fear, fading into the void. And in that final moment, as everything she had ever known disappeared into the blackness, Emily understood. There was no escape. The darkness had claimed her, as it had claimed so many before her, and it would claim many more after. She was a part of it now, a lost soul, drifting in the eternal night, waiting for the next to fall. Emily's body felt heavier than ever as the darkness began to close in around her, suffocating her senses, making her limbs ache with the weight of her own fear. The walls of the cabin pressed in tighter and tighter, until it felt like they were closing around her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't seem to fill her lungs. The figures, those hollow, lifeless creatures, moved closer, their eyes glowing with a faint, unnatural light. Their faces, pale, gaunt, twisted, seemed to leer at her, mocking her. She could feel them, every step they took, every movement they made. Their presence was overwhelming, like an invisible weight pressing down on her very soul. "You should have stayed away," the first figure whispered, its voice smooth and almost comforting in its eerie cadence. "But you were always meant to come back. This place, it calls to you. You are a part of it now." Emily's heart thundered in her chest as she backed away, her hands pressing against the walls of the cabin. Her mind was racing, each thought a frantic whisper that seemed to get lost in the chaos of her panic. She had to get out. She couldn't let them have her. She couldn't let this darkness claim her, not after everything she had fought for. But the more she tried to fight, the more the figures surrounded her. They were closing in, one by one, until she could no longer see anything but their pale faces, their hollow eyes. The air felt thick with the weight of their presence, the weight of their intentions. They didn't need to speak anymore. Their silence was enough. It was a silence that spoke of inevitability. "You can't leave," another figure said, its voice distorted, as if it had been twisted and warped by the darkness itself. "You never could. The moment you stepped into this forest, the moment you set foot in this cabin, you became part of the curse. And now you belong to us." Emily's knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the cold wooden floor, her hands clutching her head as the room spun around her. The words echoed in her mind over and over again, until they became a chant that drowned out everything else. There was no escape. She was trapped here in this place, with these things, and she could never leave. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She thought of her family, her friends, of the life she had left behind. But it all felt so distant now, so far away, like a dream she could no longer remember. All that remained was the darkness, the cold touch of the figures closing in around her, their breath, if they even had breath, filling the air with an almost suffocating weight. "You've always known this was your fate," the first figure said, its voice soft, almost soothing. "You couldn't escape it. None of us can. We are the forgotten, the lost souls who have been swallowed by the darkness. And now you will join us." Emily shook her head, her eyes wide with terror as she scrambled backward, but the walls of the cabin were closing in. It felt like the very structure of the place was shifting, bending, warping around her, trapping her inside. The figures loomed closer, their faces twisted with a strange mix of pity and hunger. Their hands reached toward her, their fingers long and skeletal, and she could feel the air grow colder as they drew nearer. "No," Emily gasped, her voice cracking with desperation. "No, I won't be one of you. I can't. I won't." The figure closest to her smiled, a smile that was more like a grimace, stretching its pale skin to the breaking point. "You have no choice, child. The darkness has claimed you, as it claimed us all. We are bound to it now. There is no escape." The words chilled her to the bone, and she tried to rise to her feet, but her body felt weak, as if the energy had been drained from her, leaving her a shell. She couldn't move, couldn't fight back. The figures closed in around her, their cold hands brushing against her skin as they held her in place. She couldn't breathe. The air in the cabin felt thick, suffocating, and the darkness seemed to crawl deeper into her lungs, into her very being. The figure who had spoken earlier stepped closer, its eyes locked onto hers. "We were once like you, full of hope, full of life. But the darkness takes that from you, little by little, until there is nothing left but the void. And when that happens, when you're just a shell of what you once were, you are free to join us. You are free to be forgotten. The words twisted in Emily's mind, her body trembling with fear and confusion. She wanted to fight, to scream, but it was as if she had no voice left. Her mind was clouded, her thoughts becoming jumbled, lost in the fog of the darkness that had taken root inside her. And then she felt it, a coldness, a presence far darker than the figures that surrounded her. It was something more ancient, more powerful. It was the source of the darkness, the thing that had been waiting for her. She could feel it deep within her, like a pull, a gravity that dragged her toward it, toward the very heart of the cabin. Her body tensed, but she couldn't resist. The figures stepped back, their hollow eyes never leaving her, as if they were waiting for her to understand. And then she saw it. In the center of the cabin, beneath the floorboards, there was a hole, a dark, gaping void that seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. It was the heart of the darkness, the source of all the horrors she had experienced. She could feel it calling to her, feel its pull. Without thinking, her body moved on its own. She crawled toward the hole, her hands trembling as she reached out, her fingers brushing the cold edges of the void. The figures didn't stop her. They watched in silence, as if this was the moment they had been waiting for. Emily's fingers brushed the edge of the hole, and everything went black. Emily felt herself falling again, but this time it wasn't a physical fall. It was a spiritual one, a descent into the depths of the unknown. The darkness, now fully surrounding her, wrapped around her mind like a shroud, pulling her into a place where nothing made sense, where time and space were distorted, and where reality seemed to crumble. There was no floor beneath her feet, no walls surrounding her. There was only the overwhelming sense of being swallowed whole, consumed by an entity older than the earth itself. Her thoughts were scattered, fragmented. She tried to grasp onto something, anything, but there was nothing. She couldn't tell if she was still in the cabin, if she was still in that cold, forgotten place beneath the earth, or if she had been taken somewhere else entirely. Everything was black, except for the faint, shimmering glow of the figures, their hollow eyes flickering in the distance like dying stars. They were watching her, waiting. Their silence was deafening, like an oppressive weight that pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. "You can't escape," the first figure's voice echoed, distant but clear. "This is where you belong now. There is no return." Emily tried to speak, to fight back, but her voice was drowned in the darkness, swallowed by the void. She felt her body grow numb, as if her very existence was fading, being erased. The air around her was thick, suffocating, as if the darkness was tightening its grip on her soul. She could feel it, the pressure, the weight of it all. It was consuming her. Then something changed. There was a flicker of light, a small, distant glimmer that caught her attention. At first, it was so faint that she thought she was imagining it, but as she focused, the light grew stronger. It was warm, familiar. It felt like the sun, like something she had long since forgotten. She reached toward it instinctively, desperate to escape the crushing blackness. But the figures didn't let her go so easily. One of them stepped forward, its skeletal hand reaching out to grasp her arm, pulling her back into the void. Its grip was icy, unrelenting. "You cannot run from your fate," the figure whispered, its voice a cruel reminder of the truth she had been trying to deny. Emily's pulse raced, her body trembling with fear and frustration. The warmth of the light, the promise of freedom, seemed so close, just within reach. But the darkness refused to release her. It tightened around her, suffocating her every thought, every movement. With all the strength she had left, she pulled herself away from the figure, breaking free of its grasp. She stumbled, her feet barely finding purchase on the non-existent ground, but she kept moving toward the light. It was calling to her, pulling her forward, offering her a chance to escape. She didn't know how much longer she could hold on. The darkness was relentless, always pushing back, always trying to drag her back into its depths. But Emily refused to give in. She couldn't let it win. She had to escape. The light grew brighter, filling her vision, until it was all she could see. And then, without warning, it enveloped her. For a brief moment, she felt warmth, like she was wrapped in the comforting embrace of the sun. She could breathe again, her chest rising and falling with each deep breath. The oppressive weight of the darkness lifted, and she felt lighter, freer than she had in what felt like an eternity. But just as quickly as the warmth had come, it vanished. The light flickered, and the darkness crept back in, swallowing her whole. "No!" Emily screamed, her voice finally breaking through the suffocating silence. "I won't go back. I won't let you take me." But it was too late. The darkness had already claimed her once more. Her body felt heavy, her mind clouded, and her senses dulled. She tried to move, to scream, but it was as if she was paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. The figures surrounded her again, their hollow eyes fixed on her with an unspoken understanding. "You are ours," the first figure said, its voice a final, chilling whisper. "And you will never leave." Emily's heart pounded in her chest, but her body no longer responded. She felt herself being pulled deeper into the abyss, her thoughts slipping further away, until she was nothing more than a whisper in the dark. And then, just as everything began to fade, a voice cut through the suffocating silence, a voice that was distant, yet somehow familiar. "Emily." She froze. The voice was clear, calling her name with an urgency that broke through the darkness. She tried to focus, to make sense of it, but the more she tried, the further away it seemed. It was like a dream, something just out of reach, but it was there, pulling her, reminding her that she wasn't completely lost. "Emily." The voice came again, stronger this time, like a lifeline thrown into the black void. She clung to it, her mind grasping for it, as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to the world of the living. The darkness recoiled, its grip loosening, just for a moment. Emily felt herself being pulled, not down into the abyss, but up toward the voice. It was her last chance, the only chance she had left. "Emily, you have to wake up. You have to fight." The words echoed in her mind, louder now, more insistent. And with every ounce of strength she had left, Emily fought. She fought against the darkness, against the figures that tried to pull her under, against the weight that threatened to crush her. And then, like a breath of fresh air, she broke free. She gasped, her lungs filling with air as the darkness receded, the cold grip of fear loosening its hold. The figures were gone, their hollow eyes faded into the distance. She was no longer trapped in the cabin, no longer surrounded by the suffocating blackness. But the voice remained. "You're free," it said, its tone warm and familiar. "But you must never return. Never come back to this place. The darkness is always waiting for you." Emily's heart pounded in her chest, but she felt the weight of the truth in those words. She had escaped, for now. But she knew the darkness was still there, lurking, waiting for the next moment of weakness. As the light enveloped her once again, she realized that the fight was far from over. It was only just beginning. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps as the darkness continued to pull her under. Yet a faint light lingered at the edge of her consciousness. It wasn't bright, not like a sun, but it was warm, reassuring. For a brief, fleeting moment, she could almost taste freedom again. She forced herself to focus, to ignore the hollow whispers of the figures as they circled her like vultures. Their mocking words echoed in her ears, but she couldn't let them drown her. "You can't escape," one figure said, its voice cold as the grave. "This is where you belong. There is no way out." Another figure joined in, its voice rasping with an ancient bitterness. "You were foolish to think you could fight this. You'll never be free." But Emily couldn't let them have her. Not now. Not when the light was so close, when she could almost feel it caressing her skin. Her heart pounded in her chest as she strained to move forward, pushing against the weight of the darkness, every inch feeling like a battle. It was so much harder now to focus, to stay grounded, but she kept her mind on the light. It was all she had left. The figures, their pale faces twisted with empty malice, reached toward her again. She could feel their icy fingers graze her arms, their touch like death itself. But she fought back. She pulled away with all her strength, forcing herself to ignore the voices that called her back into the suffocating abyss. "You cannot run," they whispered. "You can never run far enough." The words slid through her thoughts, slippery and cold, but Emily refused to listen. She had to keep moving. She had to get closer to the light. It was her only chance. Her legs trembled beneath her, her body feeling as if it were made of stone, but she pressed on, crawling through the darkness. Every part of her screamed to give up, to let go, but the flickering warmth of the light kept her going. She could feel it, its pull stronger now, like a magnet pulling her toward safety, toward life. The shadows clawed at her heels, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. And then, as if the darkness had finally given way, she saw it. The light. It wasn't a figure or a shape, but a doorway, a thin, fragile line of light cutting through the gloom. It beckoned to her, a promise of escape, of something more than this endless void. Without thinking, she lunged toward it. Her fingers stretched, her breath catching in her throat as she reached for that sliver of salvation. The shadows snarled, clawing at her from all directions, but she was so close now, so close to the end. Her fingertips brushed against the edge of the light. In that instant, everything went still. The figures stopped moving. The whispers ceased. The darkness seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. Emily didn't hesitate. With one final, desperate push, she thrust herself into the light, her body tingling as the warmth flooded her senses. The cold, suffocating air of the cabin was gone, replaced by something softer, something lighter. She felt weightless, free, and then the world shifted. Emily stumbled forward, her legs unsteady beneath her. She looked around, but everything was different. The dark trees and the desolate cabin were gone. She was standing in an open field, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight. The air was fresh and clean, a stark contrast to the heavy, oppressive atmosphere she had just escaped. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt safe. The weight that had been pressing on her chest was gone. Her breath was no longer labored, but the sense of unease didn't fade. There was something strange about this place, something off. As she looked around, She could see the distant outlines of figures standing at the edge of the field. They were too far away to make out their features, but their presence sent a chill crawling up her spine. They were watching her, just like the figures in the cabin had. "No," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Not again." She spun around, but the light she had come from, the doorway she had crossed through, was gone. There was nothing left but the moonlit field, the silent figures, and the eerie sense that she had not truly escaped. She could feel the darkness waiting, lurking just beyond the edge of her vision, ready to claim her once again. The figures in the distance began to move, slowly at first, and then faster, until they were rushing toward her with an unnatural speed. Emily's heart skipped a beat as panic surged through her. She turned to run, but her legs felt like lead. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, the earth becoming soft, unstable. She stumbled, falling to the ground, but quickly scrambled to her feet. The figures were getting closer, and their movements were no longer slow or deliberate. They were fast now, their faces twisted with rage and hunger, their eyes burning with an unnatural light. Emily's breath caught in her throat as they drew near. She could see their hands, long, bony fingers reaching toward her, their skin a sickly, grayish hue. The closer they got, the more she could feel the coldness emanating from them. She turned and ran again, but the more she ran, the further away the field seemed to stretch. No matter how fast she moved, the figures seemed to keep up with her, getting closer and closer until they were right behind her. Emily's chest heaved with exertion, her body exhausted, but she couldn't stop. Her mind raced, desperate for a way out, a way to escape them once and for all. The darkness was everywhere, surrounding her, closing in. She could feel it, the weight of it pressing on her from all sides. It was something else, and it was calling her by name. Suddenly, she stumbled again, but this time, she didn't rise. She fell to her knees, unable to keep running. She was trapped. The figures were almost upon her now, their skeletal hands reaching for her, their eyes glinting with malice. Emily screamed, her voice breaking as the darkness swallowed her whole once more. It was too much. She had fought so hard to escape, but now it seemed that nothing would ever free her from this nightmare. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the figures stopped. The field fell silent once more. The pressure on her chest, the fear, the suffocating weight of the darkness, it all vanished. She was left in complete stillness. Her mind was clouded, but she could sense something, someone watching her. There was a presence, far beyond the figures, far beyond the cabin. It was ancient, older than anything she had ever encountered, and it knew her. "Emily," a voice whispered, soft but clear. It wasn't the figures. It wasn't the cabin. It wasn't the darkness. Emily's heart pounded as the eerie voice echoed through the vast, empty field. It wasn't the same voice as the figures. No, this was something different, something older, something that felt beyond time and space. She tried to move, but her legs felt like they were made of stone, frozen in place by the weight of the presence that surrounded her. She could feel it drawing closer, its unseen eyes fixed on her, piercing through the very fabric of reality. "Emily," the voice called again, softer this time, almost gentle, yet it carried an undeniable weight of authority. It was neither comforting nor cruel, just an ancient power that was beyond her understanding. "You are not meant to be here." The words seemed to hang in the air, lingering with a suffocating force. Emily wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but her body refused to obey. It was as if the world itself had turned against her, holding her captive in this strange twilight place. "Who are you?" she managed to choke out, her voice barely a whisper, trembling with fear. Her mind was spinning, thoughts colliding in a chaotic mess of confusion. "What do you want with me?" The presence didn't answer her directly. Instead, she felt a shift in the air, a subtle movement, like the faintest ripple on a still pond. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. She could hear the faint sound of something brushing against the wind, whispers, almost imperceptible. The figures in the distance had vanished, but the feeling of being watched never left. "Your journey is not yet over," the voice responded, this time with a deeper resonance that seemed to vibrate in her bones. "You have not seen the truth. Not yet." A cold shiver ran down Emily's spine. Truth? What truth? The darkness, the figures, the endless maze of nightmares. Was this all part of something bigger? Something that she had yet to comprehend? The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift again, as if the field itself was changing, its very nature warping in response to the unseen entity's words. The sky above her had darkened further, the stars now hidden behind a layer of thick clouds. The air felt heavier now, charged with an energy she couldn't quite grasp, but it was undeniably oppressive. "You have been chosen," the voice continued, its tone filled with a cryptic sadness. "You and others like you. You are the ones who walk the line between light and shadow." Emily could feel her pulse quickening. Chosen. What did that mean? She tried to make sense of the words, but they slipped through her mind like smoke, leaving nothing behind but confusion. "Chosen for what?" she managed to ask, her voice shaking. "What do you want me to do?" The presence did not answer immediately. Instead, Emily felt a wave of emotions rush over her. Fear, sorrow, but also a strange sense of understanding, as if the answer was just out of reach, waiting for her to finally comprehend it. The weight of those emotions pressed down on her chest, and she gasped for breath. "You must face what lies ahead," the voice said. "Only then will you understand the full extent of your purpose." Emily's mind reeled. Face what? What could possibly lie ahead that could make sense of all this madness? She didn't want to know. She didn't want to face anything else. Everything had already spiraled into nightmare after nightmare. She had already been trapped in that cabin, surrounded by darkness and death. And yet, there was more. The ground trembled slightly beneath her, and she stumbled forward, her knees nearly giving out as she fought to keep her balance. The presence around her seemed to draw closer, filling the space with a deep, almost tangible power. "You must choose," it said, its voice now much closer, as if it were right beside her, though she could see nothing. "The darkness cannot be denied forever, but neither can the light." The words hung in the air, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, Emily felt something shift within her, a quiet understanding. She wasn't just running away from something. She wasn't just fleeing from the figures, or the shadows, or the cabin. No, this was something deeper. Something that tied her to this place, to this fight between light and dark. The voice was offering her something, something she couldn't yet grasp. The tension in the air thickened, as if the very atmosphere was waiting for her to make a choice. Her heart hammered in her chest, her thoughts spinning as she tried to process it all. But deep down, she knew one thing for certain. If she didn't make a choice soon, there would be nothing left to save. "You must decide now," the voice urged. "The light is fading, and the darkness is closing in. The realization struck Emily like a bolt of lightning. She was standing at a crossroads, at the edge of something far greater than she could ever have imagined. There was no escaping this fight. She had already entered the struggle between the light and the dark, and now she had to choose where she stood. But how could she choose? How could she make sense of this when everything was shrouded in uncertainty? The figures in the distance were still there, silent, waiting. The air around her was thick with the weight of their gaze. But this time, they didn't move. They just stood there, unmoving, silent. The voice continued, now soft and haunting, as though it were fading into the distance. You must face the truth, Emily. Only then can you end the cycle. Her breath caught in her throat. What cycle? What truth? Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble more violently, as though the earth itself were breaking apart. The air grew colder, and the oppressive weight of the darkness seemed to return, heavier than before. It was as if she had been pulled into the very heart of this battle, a battle that she couldn't understand but had no choice but to be a part of. She had to make a choice. She had to decide what path she would take, even if she didn't fully understand the consequences. And as the world around her started to unravel once more, Emily made her decision. The darkness and the light, the choice was hers. The air around Emily crackled with energy, her heart thundering in her chest as the ground beneath her feet continued to tremble. Her eyes scanned the field, the distant figures still standing in place, their unnerving silence more unsettling than ever. She could feel the weight of their gaze, and despite their immobility, their presence felt suffocating. The darkness and the light, those were the forces pulling at her now, and she was caught in the center, torn between them. The voice from before, the one that had guided her this far, was no longer gentle. It was insistent, like a whisper in her ear, pressing her to make a choice, to decide which side she would stand on. But how could she? How could she possibly know what was the right choice? The darkness had always been there, creeping, consuming. But the light, what was the light? Was it a trick, an illusion, or was it truly the salvation she desperately needed? You are not alone, Emily, the voice spoke again, its tone no longer cryptic, but almost reassuring, as if it understood her struggle. You have never been alone. There are others, and their choices have led them here as well. Her mind raced as she tried to process this new information. Others. Oh, she had never encountered anyone else in the cabin. Was it possible that she wasn't the only one trapped in this nightmare? That there were others, perhaps just like her, lost in the same cycle of torment and terror? Before she could dwell too much on the thought, the trembling ground beneath her suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and the air felt heavy, thick with anticipation. Emily's eyes darted to the figures in the distance. They had moved. In fact, they were now much closer, their faces coming into view for the first time. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, cold and hollow, like the eyes of predators. But what was even more terrifying than their gaze was the way they moved, slow, deliberate, as if they knew something Emily didn't. They were walking toward her now, their movements smooth and precise. The closer they came, the more the air around her seemed to pulse with dark energy, the very atmosphere vibrating with power. A chill ran down Emily's spine as they approached, the whispers in the air growing louder, overlapping, swirling around her like a storm. "You cannot hide," they murmured, their voices blending into a single haunting chorus. "The darkness will find you. It always does." Emily's heart clenched, and she took a step back, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. She couldn't move. The figures were too close now. They reached out toward her, their hands long and thin, the skin stretched tight over their bones. She could feel the coldness of their touch even from a distance, and as they reached closer, her entire body screamed for escape. But there was no place to run, no place to hide. "You have no choice," one of them said, its voice deep and guttural. "You must embrace your fate, Emily." Her breath came in ragged gasps as she backed away further, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. I won't give in." The figure before her let out a low, mocking laugh. "You already have," it whispered. Emily's pulse raced. She was at the edge of the field now, and the figures were closing in on her, their steps synchronized, their presence overwhelming. The dark energy around her intensified, pressing in from all sides. She felt as if she were suffocating, trapped in an invisible grip. Her mind screamed for her to make a decision, but she couldn't think clearly. The words of the voice rang in her ears, but they felt distant now, as if they were coming from another time, another place. "You can't fight it," the voice echoed. "It's in you, Emily. It always has been." The ground beneath her feet began to shift again, this time in a way that felt different. It was as though the very earth itself was opening up, pulling her down, as if the darkness beneath her was calling her into its depths. She stumbled, her knees buckling as she fell to the ground. She reached out instinctively, but the cold air around her was thick, like tar, and her hands couldn't seem to find purchase. "You cannot escape," the figures whispered in unison, their voices a sickening harmony. "Not now. Not ever." Emily's breath caught in her throat. The pull of the darkness was stronger than before, and she could feel it tugging at her with a force that was impossible to resist. She felt herself being drawn into it, her mind clouded with fear, her vision swimming. She was losing herself, losing everything. The light, the warmth, the hope, all of it felt so distant now. The darkness was swallowing her whole, and yet there was a flicker of something, a faint spark in the depths of her mind, a whisper of resistance. It was so small, so fragile, but it was there. She could feel it, a part of her that refused to be consumed. That part of her was what had kept her going all this time, the spark of defiance that she refused to extinguish. "You can choose," the voice said, its tone more urgent now. "You can still choose." The figures were nearly upon her now, their skeletal hands reaching out, their hollow eyes filled with malice. She was running out of time. And then, in that moment, Emily understood. The light was not something she could run to. It wasn't something external, something out there beyond her reach. No, the light was within her, always had been. The light and the dark were both within her, and it was up to her to decide which would dominate. With trembling hands, Emily reached into the core of herself, searching for that flicker of resistance, that small spark of light. It burned brighter as she grasped it, her strength returning in an overwhelming surge. The darkness clawed at her, but she held on to the light, clinging to it with every fiber of her being. The figures stopped, their movements faltering as the light grew stronger. They recoiled from it, their faces twisting in pain. The air itself seemed to pulse with the energy of the light, pushing back the darkness that had once seemed so all-encompassing. "You cannot fight," one of the figures hissed, but it was no use. The light was not just a beacon. It was power. It was hope. It was everything that the darkness could never be. With one final, defiant push, Emily released the light. The figures screamed, their bodies disintegrating into the wind, their forms vanishing into the light. The field was no longer dark. The air was clear, and the weight that had pressed upon her chest lifted. The presence that had haunted her was gone, leaving nothing but an empty silence in its wake. Emily stood there, trembling but free. She had made her choice. The field was silent now. The oppressive weight of the darkness had lifted, leaving only the stillness behind. Emily stood alone, her chest heaving, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The air felt different, lighter, as though the very world around her had been transformed. The figures were gone, their presence nothing more than a lingering memory now, vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. Emily's heart still raced, but the fear that had consumed her moments before was gone, replaced by a strange sense of peace. She had made her choice. She had faced the darkness head-on and had refused to be swallowed by it. She had chosen the light, not because it was the easy path, but because it was the only path that felt right. She stood in the middle of the field, looking around her. The once oppressive shadows had retreated, and the distant landscape was now bathed in a soft, ethereal glow. The night no longer felt heavy with doom. Instead, there was a quiet serenity, a calm that had settled over everything. It was as if the very fabric of reality had been rewritten, reshaped by her decision. But Emily knew that her journey wasn't over. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. The voice, the one that had guided her through her struggles, returned once more. It wasn't as ominous as before, no longer filled with cryptic warnings. Instead, it was calm, steady, and almost proud. "You have done well, Emily," the voice said, its tone filled with a quiet satisfaction. "You have chosen wisely. The light has always been inside you, waiting to be embraced." Emily felt the weight of the words, understanding their meaning more clearly now. It wasn't just about choosing between light and dark. It was about embracing who she was, understanding the strength that had always been within her. The darkness had never truly had control. It only existed because she had allowed it to, because she had feared it. But now, with the light inside her, the darkness had no power. She exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. The fight wasn't over, but it was different now. She didn't have to face it alone. She never had. The ground beneath her feet shifted again, and Emily's attention snapped back to her surroundings. A faint rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, and the skies began to darken once more. But this time, it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a reminder of what she had overcome, and of the challenges that still lay ahead. The voice continued, softer now, almost as if it were fading into the background. "You are stronger than you know, Emily. But remember, the path you've chosen is not without its trials. There will be moments of doubt, moments when the darkness will try to reclaim you. But if you stand firm in the light, you will always find your way." Emily nodded, her grip on the light within her tightening. She had come this far, and she knew she couldn't turn back now. The world may still be uncertain, the future still clouded, but for the first time in a long while, Emily felt like she was ready to face whatever came next. The sky above her began to shift once again, the clouds parting to reveal a sliver of moonlight breaking through. The soft glow illuminated the field around her, casting long shadows that danced in the breeze. It was a beautiful, quiet night, the kind of night that felt like a fresh start, a new beginning. And for the first time since this nightmare had begun, Emily could see the path ahead. As she took a step forward, the earth beneath her felt solid, unyielding. The storm in the distance seemed to fade away, replaced by the gentle sound of rain beginning to fall. It was a peaceful rain, soft and steady, like a lullaby for the soul. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to simply breathe, to be in the moment. She was alive. She had made it, and that was enough for now. But deep down, she knew the journey wasn't over. There was still more to uncover, more to understand. The shadows may have retreated for now, but they would always be there, lurking in the corners of her mind, waiting for the right moment to strike. The voice had warned her, and she knew better than to ignore it. But Emily wasn't afraid anymore. The light within her was stronger than any darkness she had faced. It was a part of her, something she couldn't lose, no matter how hard the world tried to make her doubt. And so, with one final breath, she took another step forward, leaving behind the remnants of the darkness and moving into the unknown. The world stretched out before her, vast and uncertain, but Emily knew one thing for sure. She was no longer afraid. Emily stood at the edge of the field, her senses tingling with the quiet hum of the world around her. The rain had stopped, leaving the air cool and crisp, the earth beneath her feet soft and wet. The moonlight filtered through the clouds, casting a pale, ethereal glow over the landscape. She felt at peace for the first time in what felt like forever. The weight of the darkness, the figures, the torment, everything seemed to have dissolved into the air. She was no longer trapped. But as she stood there, looking out at the quiet expanse, something stirred within her. A lingering feeling, a shadow that she couldn't quite place. It tugged at her, pulling her attention back to the cabin, the place where all of this had begun. "You're free," the voice whispered softly, the words like a breath in the night. "But freedom comes with its own cost." Emily frowned, turning her gaze back to the distant silhouette of the cabin. The light inside her flickered softly, reminding her of what she had fought for. But that lingering feeling remained, like a thread she couldn't pull free from. Without thinking, she started walking toward the cabin, her steps slow but deliberate. She didn't know why she was going back. She should leave, she should move on, find her way out of this place. But something called to her, something deep inside that refused to let go. As she neared the cabin, the air grew heavier, charged with a quiet tension that made her skin crawl. The door, which she had left wide open when she fled, now stood ajar, a faint creak coming from within as if beckoning her forward. The light from outside barely touched the interior, and for a moment Emily hesitated. But then, as if on cue, the voice spoke again, this time not with the warmth of guidance, but with an unsettling finality. "Not everything is as it seems." A cold shiver ran down Emily's spine. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer, the weight of her choices pressing against her chest. The voice had warned her before, but this time its tone was different, darker, more insistent. She couldn't turn back. Not now. As she reached the door, she paused, staring into the dark interior. It was empty, silent, and yet she felt something shift within the shadows. A presence. Not the comforting light she had embraced, but something else. Something watching, waiting. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. The door creaked shut behind her with a soft click, and in the silence that followed, Emily felt the very air around her shift again. Something had changed. Something was different. As she stood in the heart of the cabin, the floorboards groaning beneath her feet, Emily couldn't help but feel a strange sense of anticipation. she wasn't alone here. Not truly. The light inside her flickered, its warmth offering no answers, no assurances. And then, a voice, unfamiliar and cold, echoed in the dark corners of the cabin. "You've come back." Emily's heart skipped a beat. The light inside her flickered again, and in the growing darkness, she realized that this was only the beginning. Her heart skipped a beat, but as the figure drew closer, she saw that it wasn't him. It was something else, something dark. The forest wasn't done with her yet. Rachel turned, her breath quickening as the shadows of the woods closed in around her once more. If you enjoyed the story, be sure to give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales. Thank you for listening, and until next time, stay safe and keep your lights on.